Tyranny of Steel, Chapters 88 to 113. Chapter 88 Military Reforms. A few days had passed since Berengar had begun plotting against Count Lothar and his backers, which was long enough for his father's vassals to gather within the castle of Kufstein. Realizing that he would have to completely reform the military structure now that he was incorporating the professional army with the town militia into a single cohesive force, he had called all of his father's vassals to Kufstein so that he could directly inform him that he would be removing their feudal rights to raise their own armies. This was a decision which he knew he had to make eventually to modernize the military fully, but as of right now, he knew this would be a bitter pill to swallow for the men who served his father. After all, he was essentially revoking their right to defend their own land with their own armies. With the men gathered in the Great Hall, Berengar sat upon the seat of power as Viscount in every way but name. The young regent made his shocking declaration to the men who swore allegiance to his family. As of today, I am hereby abolishing the rights of my family's vassals to raise their own armies and will instead be incorporating them into a single cohesive military under the control of the Viscount of Kufstein, where one's ranking is based entirely upon merit and not birth. With this said, the room resounded with the protests of dozens of minor lords and knights. The knights were especially outraged with this decree, as by doing away with the feudal traditions of the military, Berengar was essentially depriving them of their purpose in life. Despite the fury of the noblemen, they kept themselves well behaved due to the fact that Berengar was flanked by his elite guard, who had been formed from the ranks of his greatest grenadier. They were prepared for any act of rebellion against their lord and commander, and as such, viciously stared down the unruly mob of gentlemen. Eventually, Berengar slammed his fist upon his armrest, which instantly quieted the room before he began to speak further. I have invited every one of you here personally to inform you of this decision and to address any concerns you may have. As such, you are free to voice them one at a time in a civil manner. An old knight was the first to approach Berengar and voice his concerns. I am a knight, like my father before me, and his father before him. What am I supposed to do now that I can no longer fight for my lord? Berengar smiled gently at the man, as he knew his concerns all too well and had already prepared a response for such a question. I am sure your expertise in warfare is needed among the ranks of my army, and as such, I will offer you a place among its ranks. So long as you complete the necessary training, you will receive a position as a commissioned officer. From there, you may progress in the ranks based upon your ability. Though the man wanted to protest further, yet he could tell Berengar would not budge, and as such, he responded to Berengar's words. I will take it under consideration. Afterward, the man returned to the crowd, where a minor lord rose and voiced his opinion on the matter. If the army is entirely under your command, then who will protect my borders? Berengar once more smiled gently at the man as he expressed how the military would function going forward. Forts will be constructed in each region to ensure proper defense. These forts will be manned by a garrison of soldiers who fall under the command of the army. These garrisons will also be in charge of law enforcement until a time where a self-sufficient and dedicated police force is established in the region. Many of these lords were familiar with how Berengar had chosen to rule. Over the last month or so since he ascended to regency, Berengar had forced his reforms on his vassals one at a time. It was getting to the point where many of them were thinking of rebelling. Yet right when they were considering such an option, Berengar not only planned to undermine their ability to effectively do so but establish garrisons in their territory, which were manned by soldiers loyal only to him. This was considered absolutely unacceptable to many of the lords shackled by vassalage to the von Kufstein family. Nevertheless, the lords had no choice but to accept these terms. After all, they were all aware of how quickly Berengar had put down the Baron of Kitzbühel's army, which was far larger than anything they could muster. Many of these knights and lords were present to witness such a shocking display of power. It was something they would never forget in their lifetime. One by one, the lords and knights of Kufstein voiced their concerns, and Berengar addressed each and every one of them with a carefully planned answer. By the time the convention was over, Berengar had received all of their signatures while signing the military reforms into law, thus dealing a mortal blow to the old feudal system in which he was inching ever closer to completely replacing. For now, what settled the noblemen's minds was that they still had access to their land and would thus be able to live a lavish lifestyle without having to worry about dying in war. They could leave that to the common people and those foolish enough to glorify such a thing. If they knew that Berengar was currently designing land reforms that would completely strip them of their ownership over such vast swaths of land and redistribute it to the public and private sectors, they would have tried to skin him alive then and there, even with his elite guard present. Fortunately for Berengar, these old and bitter men had no knowledge that their feudal authority would soon come completely crashing down upon them. Their roles as nobles would soon become little more than a ceremonial title passed down throughout their family. Of course, to ensure there was not an outright rebellion, Berengar was thinking of ways to appease the nobles and maintain some degree of their wealth. However, that was a discussion for another time. For now, Berengar had successfully enacted his military reforms and would be incorporating all knights, men-at-arms, and other professional soldiers into the ranks of what would one day become known as the Imperial Army. Chapter 89: Becoming an Arms Dealer. With the military reforms in place, Berengar began incorporating the militia and professional army into one cohesive force. The men were made to swear an oath under pain of death and damnation that they would protect the realm from all foreign and domestic enemies while also swearing their allegiance to the Viscounty and its commander-in-chief, which at this point was Berengar. Afterward, roughly 1,000 infantry were transferred into the ranks of the 1st and 2nd Infantry Battalions. By doing this, Berengar ensured that the new and possibly disgruntled troops were alongside those that were already completely loyal to him so that they had no chances of turning on him. As far as the 30 knights under his command were concerned, they were transferred into the ranks of the 1st Cuirassier Battalion, which was growing in numbers by the day. The expense in raising cavalry was far more than that of infantry or artillery, yet it would be worth the amount as far as Berengar was concerned. Thus, he had no qualms about funding such an endeavor. Though it would take a few months for the new troops to go through basic and specialized training, he was confident by the time the upcoming war broke out that he would have a large, well-trained, and well-equipped army that was far greater than any force in the world that was equal in size. Every day the arms factory and the armory worked to produce the necessary equipment for Berengar's army to properly field. As such, he quickly was left with a vast stockpile of the obsolete weapons and armor that kept growing by the day. Eventually, Berengar decided he would sell the equipment to Count Lothar at a discount, considering it was used equipment, and some of it had been especially fitted to certain people. He would never think of gaining full price for it. Nevertheless, it was fully functional equipment and better in quality than basically anything else in the world aside from his own forces. Thinking of this idea, he personally wrote the letter to Count Lothar, who was more than interested in the offer and absolutely curious why Berengar would be selling such a large amount of steel plate and brigandine. Thus the man made his way to Kufstein as quickly as possible, where he was currently meeting with Berengar in his armory which housed the equipment, where the two noblemen discussed the exact details of the trade. Count Lothar was not shy with his questions. He could not think of a reason why Berengar would give up such valuable equipment unless it were faulty. So why are you selling such a vast quantity of steel arms and armor? Do you not need it for yourself? Berengar began to laugh. He had already planned an excuse for selling his army's obsolete equipment. I am currently investing in a massive infrastructure initiative, and I need more capital than I am making on the steel and textile trade. I figured my peasant levies did not need such superior equipment. Thus I decided to sell it and equip them with a much cheaper design of the armor. Lothar did not even think twice about this answer. It was entirely reasonable, especially since Berengar said this equipment was used to outfit peasant levies. The armorers that Lothar had brought with him began inspecting every piece of equipment to determine if it would hold up. The equipment had only ever seen one battle, and most of the men were completely untouched in that battle. As such, it was in fantastic condition. While his men were inspecting the equipment, Lothar began discussing terms on the sale of such a vast amount of high-quality arms and armor. Everything except for the pikes used in the previous battle was for sale. If my armoires confirm the quality of the equipment, then I would be more than happy to purchase the goods off of your hands. However, because it is used, and much of it will require refitting, I cannot offer you full price for the lot. Considering the equipment was almost entirely brigandine, with steel helmets, and a small number of steel vambraces, and greaves which were thrown into the mix, the value was quite substantial as the manufacture of such a mass amount of equipment was unheard of at this time. As such, Count Lothar threw out an enticing offer. I will pay 10 guldens per set of armor as well as a matching weapon. The gulden was a gold coin in use for currency, and when considering the price of a steel breastplate by itself was worth a little over 4 guldens brand new. as well as the fact that this was mostly used Brigandine, it was a fair price. However, Berengar would milk Count Lothar for every piece of the equipment's worth and immediately countered his offer with a higher figure. 15. Count Lothar frowned at this number and offered with a new figure. 12. Berengar shook his head and negotiated with his final offer while wearing a smug smile on his face. 13. And I'll cover transportation. If you don't accept, I'm sure the Count of Steiermark would be happy to have such fine equipment for his armies. Berengar had struck a nerve with Count Lothar. After all, the man was well aware that Count Otto was a loyalist to the main Habsburg line and someone he considered to be a future enemy. If Berengar sold his equipment to that man, then it would surely make things difficult for him. After all, with this equipment, it would greatly diminish his need to buy raw steel and manufacture it himself. After careful deliberation, Count Lothar had no choice to accept and cursed at Berengar. Damn it, all right, I accept your terms. However, although they shook hands and smiled at one another, Lothar was secretly thinking within his mind. What an idiot, he has no idea the danger that is approaching, and he just sold such valuable equipment to his enemy, leaving his armies in a poor state. The Teutonic Order should be able to wipe his army with ease. Lothar had no way of knowing that this armor he was being sold, which he thought was the pinnacle of equipment in Europe right now, and possibly the world, was already considered obsolete in Berengar's mind, and that the young regent was already in the process of replacing it with better equipment for his forces to use. Berengar smiled with an arrogant expression as he was all too aware of what Lothar was thinking and could not wait to see the look on his face when his forces were torn asunder by the thunder of Berengar's guns. With this first step, Berengar had entered the arms trade and made a massive profit of a whopping 13,000 guldens or close to it. He would use some of this profit to invest in the arms trade, where he would begin to supply all factions of the upcoming civil war, from which he would profit significantly. Only for the factions who bought his equipment to come to the horrific realization that against the might of the flintlock muskets and 12-pound cannons of Berengar's army, the equipment they had been sold was completely and utterly useless. Chapter 90. Ludolf's Reformation. Ludolf had been hard at work on his academic refutation of the Church's corruption and abuse of power. So much so that his manifesto had grown even larger than Martin Luther's from Berengar's previous life. After collecting evidence of the Church's sins and its wrongful attempts to dominate secular affairs, Ludolf compiled it together in a well-written thesis completely disputing the Church and its insidious actions. He had spent nearly a month gathering what he needed in an attempt to reform the Church for the better. Now that he had finished writing his paper, the priest brought it to Berengar's attention for review and possible alterations. Berengar smiled as he read through the manifesto, which spoke many of his ideals, and unlike Luther, he spent a large amount of time focusing on the necessity for church and state. From an academic standpoint, the work was solid. From a theological standpoint, it was brilliant. After reading through the whole thing, Berengar placed down the paper and looked at Ludolf, who had been silently waiting in patience for Berengar to finish it as he sat upon the seat of power in Kufstein. After placing down the manifesto with great care, he approached Ludolf and patted the man on the shoulders. "My friend, it is a work of brilliance. I am truly inspired after reading it. This must be distributed across the German-speaking regions and Europe as a whole. With my press, it can be mass-produced much like the Bibles we have been distributing and spread to the hands of true believers everywhere." Ludolf smiled greatly upon hearing the massive praise he received. He too agreed that the work needed to be spread. As such, he did not hesitate to agree to Berengar's suggestion of mass-producing and distributing it across the German-speaking regions of the world. "Thank you, Berengar. I must say I would never have walked this path without your guidance. It is truly an honor to be your friend." Berengar grabbed the paper and placed it in Ludolf's hands before complimenting the man further. "The pleasure is all mine. Now shall we head to the press and begin the process?" Ludolf nodded and agreed to Berengar's request once more, and as such, Berengar and Ludolf marched down to the press, which was now located within its own factory run by his propaganda department. Berengar's elite guards flanked the two men as they did so. Despite being in the safety of Kufstein, Berengar had made many enemies, and he could never be too careful when it came to his safety. The average citizens looked upon the men as they marched into the city under construction and into the industrial district where they entered the press, where the foreman was more than happy to greet them. As always, the man was a bootlicker and showered Berengar and his guest in compliments upon arrival. "My lord, it is an absolute pleasure to witness your immaculate visage enter the factory. Tell me, how can I help you on this glorious day? Berengar could not help but sneer at the man's remarks. He was not the kind of man who desired to be around sycophants. Nevertheless, the man was good at his job, and as such, Berengar kept him in place. I need a special production line dedicated to the mass production of this work. Can it be done? The foreman once more put on the air as he continued to compliment Berengar, which ultimately looped right back around to a simple agreement. Of course, my lord, for your benevolence, I can make anything possible. As you know, we have expanded operations quite successfully lately, and as such, we can easily afford to dedicate full-time production to this work. With that said, Berengar motioned for Ludolf to hand it over, after which the priest quickly did so. Berengar looked around the area and noticed that the security was lacking for this vital installation. As such, he looked over to the foreman and informed him of his decision. I will attach a security detail around this facility around the clock. It looks like the garrison needs more forces. With the influx of recruits to his army, Berengar established a significant garrison in Kufstein whose full-time job would be to defend the region and act as internal security. Essentially, they would become the gendarmerie until he could establish a dedicated police force. After saying that, Berengar left while trying to ignore the exaggerated praise from the foreman who could refrain himself from saying such flatteries. After Berengar and Ludolf returned to the castle, he pulled out a pair of goblets before filling them with wine and handing one to Ludolf before saying a toast. To the Reformation, may the Church be purged of its corruption. The two men clinked glasses before taking a sip. Ludolf, of course, could not refrain from his excitement. I truly do hope something comes of my work. I cannot sit idly by and allow the Church to be blighted by the immoral bishops and cardinals who turn a blind eye to the teachings of Christ in pursuit of their greed. Berengar merely smiled and took a sip from his glass. He knew the possibility of the Catholic Church actually being reformed was very slim. What was most likely to happen from Ludolf's actions was the Church splitting off and forming the Protestant movement. Though such an event would inevitably lead to chaos within the European sphere of influence, Berengar needed that chaos to transition the German world into a scientific and industrious way of thinking. As the two men celebrated their achievement, only Berengar was aware of how things would turn out. The future would be filled with endless blood and destruction due to these two men's actions. Yet, it would allow Berengar to build one of the mightiest empires in history. An achievement that would one day brand him as the father of the German nation. Among his many nicknames for which he would be known, this was the one of which he was most proud. Chapter 91 Council of Constance I. Nearly a month had passed since Ludolf made his public denunciation of the Church, and by then, thousands of copies of his manifesto had spread across the German-speaking regions. Priests, bishops, and noblemen alike flocked to his cause, sharing their support for his claims. What started as a localized heresy as it was deemed by the Church quickly consumed the German world and caught on like wildfire. The Catholic Church was in a crisis. Both the papacy in Avignon and the Vatican publicly declared Ludolf's Reformation as an extension of the Berengar heresy, which the Vatican had long since been trying to combat the growing influence. Having the support of Berengar the Accursed, as the Church referred to him, actually helped Ludolf's cause, considering many of the German noblemen privately sympathized with his plight. However, now that a properly ordained priest had publicly endorsed his ideas, which had already begun to spread around Austria, they quickly became openly accepted by many seeking to end the Church's influence over secular affairs. It did not take long for the Church to convene a council over this issue, and several of the other issues which plagued the Catholic Church at the moment, such as the reconciliation of the papacy and the affairs of the Teutonic Order, now that they had thoroughly provoked the Orthodox Church with their crusade of the Rus. A group of cardinals, bishops, and two men, both declaring themselves the one true pope, sat in a chapel located within the bishopric of Constance, a region within the Holy Roman Empire, and what would be considered part of the Kingdom of Germany. The large group of men was currently in a heated debate, firstly over the issue of the Berengar heresy, which was now spreading rapidly across the German world. If something were not done soon, then even if they successfully managed to root out and destroy Berengar the Accursed and his regency, they would still not be able to squash this heresy thoroughly. Pope Simeon II, who was the officially recognized Pope of the Vatican, was in an argument with his counterpart from Avignon, who was known by the name of Pope Avilius III. Simeon was the first to speak up about the Berengar heresy, which was beginning to become a serious issue for everyone in the room. If we do not put an end to this heresy while it is still within its infancy, it might fracture the Church as a whole. Clearly, we must get not only the crusading orders, but the pious noblemen from every Christian kingdom to march into the regions most affected by this blasphemy, and put every one of these heretics to the sword. Avilius, on the other hand, could not help but scoff at this notion. It was utterly ludicrous to think that they could get the entirety of Christendom to invade Germany. The German lords would not simply allow an army of foreigners into their lands to butcher their people. If anything, it would unify the German states and prevent the upcoming civil war, which the Church desperately wanted to happen to take advantage of the chaos and gain more power and influence. As such, the other so-called pope in the room could not refrain from refuting the first one. Tell me, Simeon, how do you plan to differentiate the believers from the heretics? Simeon did not hesitate to offer his opinion and boldly declared for the whole room to hear. God will know. The implication being that they would kill everyone in the affected areas and leave it up to God to judge their souls. After all, it would not be the first time the Church had done something like this. Several of the high-ranking members of the ecclesiarchy nodded their heads in approval of this suggestion. In contrast, many others looked in horror at the suggestion of doing such a thing. Ultimately, the voice of reason came down to a particularly charismatic cardinal who suggested to all of them a more diplomatic approach. Have either of you actually tried reasoning with the man we call Berengar the Accursed? Clearly, the man is an educated individual with a vast knowledge of Scripture. Seeing as how before Ludolf even made his accusations against us, Berengar had accurately translated the Bible into German and began distributing it, along with his own interpretations in a series of pamphlets. Both Simeon and Avilius shook their heads. In fact, if anything, Simeon was guilty of constantly escalating the conflict. By now, he was familiar with how Berengar reacted to anyone who tried to exert their authority upon him, and clearly, it had negative results. As such, the cardinal continued his speech and laid part of the blame on the Pope of the Vatican. Simeon, if you took a second to reflect on this matter, you would realize that if you had not endorsed Lambert's attempt to eliminate his older brother and steal the inheritance, which is rightfully Berengar's, then none of this would have happened. Every time you try to force your way upon a lawfully appointed regent, it blows up in your face. A mere youth has outwitted you in every matter you have conspired against him in. Who's to say he is not going to outwit and defeat you once more when you invade his lands with the Teutonic Order? After being lambasted and accurately so by a cardinal under his command, Pope Simeon II lowered his head in disgrace for all of the bishops and cardinals to see. What the cardinal had said was true. However, he would be damned if he did not have Berengar pay for the constant humiliation he had suffered, including the one that had just transpired here in the Council of Constance. As such, Simeon could not help himself but protest the very notion that the Almighty Church should be negotiating with a lowly regent of a viscounty. I refuse, as God's representative here on earth, I will not bow my head to some lowly viscount or his accursed son acts as regent in his stead. I will have satisfaction for the indignant actions of this heretical youth. With that, the Council of Constance was divided on how to proceed on the matter of the Berengar heresy. Some wanted to invade the lands in which were affected by it and slaughter every living person within them. Some wanted to negotiate with Berengar to see if he would cease his anti-church propaganda, and some secretly sided with Berengar and the points he and Ludolf had made. If anything, Simeon's reaction to the whole thing proved that Berengar was right. However, they were too afraid to voice their concerns and, as such, stayed silent. These bishops and cardinals who agreed with Berengar and Ludolf would become the backbone of the German Reformation. For now, the council continued. There were plenty of topics to talk about, and they had yet to conclude how to proceed with Berengar and his views. Chapter 92 Council of Constance II. The figureheads of the ecclesiarchy debated well into the night about their arguments before concluding the meeting for the evening. After a night of proper rest, they reconvened in an attempt to discuss further the potential solutions to the problems which plagued the Catholic Church at the moment. Rather than discuss the Berengar heresy further, as they had exhausted so much effort on only to remain entrenched in their own positions, Pope Avilius chugged a chalice of wine before he brought up the growing divide with the Orthodox Church over the issues of the Teutonic Order, who, while favored by the Pope of the Vatican, was not gazed upon fondly by Avilius and the Avignon papacy. As such, he spoke his thoughts on the matter. The Teutonic Order has gone too far by forcefully converting the Orthodox of the East into Catholicism if things progress from where they are now. Relations with the Byzantines, as well as their sphere of influence, will continue to drop. The support of the Hospitallers in the Byzantines' efforts to reclaim North Africa can only stall a permanent rift for so long. Something must be done about this unlawful crusade in which Simeon has sponsored. Like a true Frenchman, Avilius, who was gulping down wine as if it were water, was not afraid to directly blame the crisis at hand as the fault of his rival, when in reality the Teutonic Order was an independent state and was largely acting on its own without the official endorsement of either papacy. Though Simeon had never outright condemned them, after all, they were still a powerful force he could call upon to enforce his will upon the increasingly secular lords of the German world. This did not mean that he, in fact, supported them, at least publicly. This was the main reason the Orthodox had not outrightly schismed from the actions of the Teutonic Order, as officially they were a monastic state acting on their own accord without the public endorsement of the Church. Avilius was more than happy to tie their actions to Simeon and his so-called papacy despite knowing this. After hearing these accusations, Simeon was outraged and instantly began bickering with his French counterpart. Lies and slander. I have never once endorsed the war against the Orthodox. Those bastards have their own self-sufficient state and have used their power to declare this a holy war on their own. Simeon was playing right into the hands of Avilius, who was obviously trying to provoke Simeon's wrath so that he would further make a fool of himself in front of the cardinals and bishops who had gathered. It seemed to be working quite well, as even those in Simeon's camp were quite embarrassed by his actions. Once more, the voice of reason was left to the particularly charismatic cardinal, who had pretty much been responsible for keeping this entire council civil throughout the last 24 hours. Simeon, while I understand your reasons for not condemning the Teutonic Order, after all, none of us want a repeat of what happened to the Templars. I can't help but ask why you have not withdrawn funding from these crusades in the north if you are so morally against it. I mean, the Baltic has been thoroughly converted at this point, so what is the purpose of further funding the Teutonic Order's ongoing conquests of their Orthodox neighbors? Once more, Simeon did not have a proper answer to this. After all, he could not openly admit that he had disdain for the Orthodox Church and that he actually supported the actions of the Teutonic Order as they forced Catholicism on their eastern neighbors. His disdain for the Orthodox was that they refused to recognize his authority as the Vicar of Christ and thus the ruler over all Christians. This was one of the reasons he despised the French at the moment, because they boldly declared Avilius to be the one true pope. After silence for a few moments, the charismatic cardinal once more spoke up, insisting that Simeon answer for his actions. Well, we are all waiting. After another few moments of silence, Simeon came up with what he perceived to be a valid excuse for his actions. The Teutonic Order are the guardians of the faithful in the German-speaking regions. Without proper funding, how could they possibly combat the heresies which have begun to spring up from within the Kingdom of Germany and the surrounding regions? Avilius laughed at this response and chastised Simeon for his reasoning. The Teutonic Order has been trying to convert the Orthodox in Eastern Europe for decades. Yet, they have received funding from the Vatican the entire time. The heresies popping up in southern Germany are a recent thing that only transpired these past few months. Do you really think that is a valid excuse for your actions? The charismatic cardinal sighed in response to these two old men and their ceaseless bickering. Simeon was a control freak who desired to rule the world and had fewer brain cells than a goldfish when he was thoroughly enraged, which more often than not he was in such a state. At the same time, Avilius was an indolent and drunken wastrel who gained pleasure from antagonizing people, especially Simeon. Neither of these two men was fit to call themselves God's representative on earth. Nevertheless, at the moment, these two fools were the highest authority in the Church. Of course, if the Western Schism was ended and one of these two incompetent asshats was recognized universally as Pope in the Catholic world, it would only mean disaster. It was becoming increasingly obvious to the cardinals and bishops present as the conversation went on that the removal of both of these pretenders and the election of a new pope altogether would be the best path forward. However, nobody was willing to bring up this discussion at the moment in fear of being excommunicated for merely suggesting it. Thus, despite the obvious inadequacies of both men proclaiming themselves pope, they would go on to rule over their territories for at least another year before things would progress any further. With no viable solutions to the problems at hand, this constant bickering would continue for another week. Ultimately, like the previous years, the Council of Constance, which had been ongoing to some degree since 1414, ended in a miserable failure. None of the discussions were met with a proper solution, and all that managed to happen was further division in the church. Simeon would continue to antagonize Berengar over the following year, and Berengar would continue to spit in his face. For now, just like it had in prior years, the meeting of the ecclesiarchy known as the Council of Constance had ended with absolutely nothing worthy of note being accomplished. Chapter 93 Formal Abdication. Berengar awoke bright and early once more. After getting in his normal exercise routine and taking care of his personal hygiene, he ventured to the dining room, where he would arrive at roughly the same time every morning. However, much to his surprise, both his mother and father were already sitting at the head of the table. In his father's hands was a list of reports, ledgers, and laws Berengar had signed into place during his father's absence. There was a serious expression on his father's face. Berengar assumed the man was going to end his so-called solitary penance and assume the mantle of Viscount. However, what was actually about to transpire would greatly shock him. It was not until Henrietta and Lind had arrived that Sieghard placed down the papers from his hands and addressed his family with the concerns he had deeply thought through since he secluded himself from the world at large. Henrietta was deeply concerned by her father's haggard appearance. She had not seen the man in quite some time, months even, and he had grown significantly older and frailer in this time period. This was the first time she witnessed the poor condition her father was in. His hair was now completely gray while being long, raggedy, and oily, his beard unkempt, and his eyes were sunken. She barely even recognized her father, who used to be so filled with life. On the other hand, while looking a bit exhausted, Gisela still maintained her beauty, albeit at some expense. Neither of the two siblings' parents was as vibrant and healthy as they had been before Lambert's exile. Henrietta quickly voiced her unease. "Daddy, are you okay? You look unwell?" Sieghard drank from a glass of water before attempting to placate his loving daughter about his failing health. "I'm fine. I have just become a little ill, but I assure you I will make it through this." Though Henrietta was deeply concerned about the man's well-being, she chose to believe her father's words. After addressing his daughter's worries, Sieghard cleared his throat before making an announcement. "Berengar, during my absence, you have turned out to be a far better ruler than I could have ever been. Not only have you expanded our territory and power, but you have begun to break ground on the construction of a magnificent city, all while balancing our coffers perfectly. Words cannot express how impressed I am by your actions." Berengar smiled as he heard the compliments from his father, who had been ruling the Barony of Kufstein for decades. However, the words that followed shocked him deeply. "Because of this, it is with a heavy heart that I must announce that I am no longer in the condition to rule this land anymore. Thus today, I will formally abdicate in front of my council and announce you, my only son and heir, as the new Viscount of Kufstein. I am sure you will go on to do great things in the future." Berengar was deeply astounded by these words. Out of all the ends to his father's reign, he never figured the man would voluntarily abdicate and retire. As such, he had many questions for his father and his decision. "I am to be the new Viscount? Then father, what will you do?" Sieghard chuckled lightly, which induced a slight cough. He told Berengar of his plans after recovering himself. "I will retire to the countryside in a villa, where I will live out the rest of my days in peace. Some fresh air would do wonders for my condition." Berengar sighed. This was truly the best end he could ask for his father. The man was now far too frail to go to war, as he had once desired. Hopefully, Sieghard could find some much-needed rest and cure the demons he harbored inside him, which began to manifest after what happened to Lambert. He could tell Berengar was struggling with this news and decided to comfort him. "Do not worry, my son, as I have already stated, you have done wondrously on your own, and I am certain you are destined for great things. I would only be holding you back if I continued to rule this land." Though Berengar agreed with these words, he felt he would be missing something now that his parents would be moving away. On the other hand, Henrietta was concerned about her future and where she should go and, as such, asked her father like an obedient little daughter. "Daddy, what will happen to me?" The old Viscount stretched out his hand and grabbed onto his daughter's in an attempt to comfort her as he gave her one final order. "You will stay here with your brother and obey his every command as if he were your father. He will provide for you and eventually find you a good husband to marry. I completely trust him in this regard. Tears began to stream down Henrietta's eyes as she nodded her head in agreement. She could not make out the words she wanted to say and instead ran over to her father and hugged him. Lind, of course, was quite happy with the results. Despite the fact that Berengar currently held absolute authority in the territory due to his large and powerful army, the nobles were technically sworn in fealty to his father. As such, they had begun to grow quite rebellious with Berengar's many reforms. The only thing keeping them in check was the overwhelming might of Berengar and his military. With his father's formal abdication, they would have no excuse to disobey Berengar's orders and could not create any crazy conspiracy theories to justify the act of open rebellion. After discussing things for some time, the family began to eat breakfast together. They did not have many more occasions to do so in the future. Because of this, they took advantage of this moment to enjoy time together as a mostly intact family. When the meal was finally over, Sieghard had gathered his council in the great hall where he sat upon the seat of power in Kufstein one last time. By his right-hand side was Berengar, who stood at attention. When every person of political importance within the town of Kufstein had gathered in the room, Sieghard stood up from his chair and made a shocking declaration, one which would go on to resound in history as a deciding factor in Berengar's rapid rise to power. Standing boldly in front of the gathered nobles, Sieghard made his decree for all to hear. I, Sieghard von Kufstein, first of my name and the current Viscount of Kufstein, hereby declare my formal abdication of power, and henceforth transfer my land, and titles, and wealth to my only son and heir Berengar von Kufstein. All kneel before your new Viscount. With those words being spoken, every person in the hall kneeled before their new sovereign with a great degree of respect. Berengar was now officially the Viscount of Kufstein and would wield his power to a great degree. The changes he would make in the following months would thoroughly transform Kufstein into a semi-modern state and invoke the ire of the church and nobles alike. Chapter 94 Legal Reforms. Weeks had passed since Berengar assumed the title of Viscount, and all of his father's vassals had come and gone after swearing fealty to the new regime. Berengar, of course, was quite pleased with the results. Even the hardcore backers of Lambert had swallowed their pride and knelt before him and kissed his ring. The fact that he did not need to fire a shot to ensure his controversial transition to power was a victory in and of itself. Currently, Berengar was in his study going over the codification of laws in Kufstein and overhauling practically everything. The first change he provided was the concept of equal protection under the judicial system to all citizens regardless of class and gender. This in itself would become quite a point of contention towards the nobles in his territory. Still, as Viscount, and with an overwhelming military force under his direct command, he did not fear any act of insurrection on their part. The second major act of reform was the establishment of an innocent until proven guilty system, inspired by the legal system of the country in which he resided in his past life. Berengar completely turned the judicial system on its head with the establishment of proper courts, lawyers, law enforcement, and everything else you could think of for a semi-modern judicial system. The new legal codex had gotten rid of several asinine traditions like trial by combat, which had actually been a way for people to determine trials within many of the Germanic regions. The next major legal reform in which Berengar took care of was establishing a legislative branch of government that represented both the nobility and the commoners. To put it simply, the more Berengar expanded, the more work he found himself drowning under, and he needed a dedicated branch of government to handle these affairs for him. As such, he built a system inspired once more by the American legislative branch from his previous life. Essentially, his Congress had two chambers. Much like America, however, it was split between a House of Commons and a House of Lords, much like Britain was in his past life. The House of Commons consisted of representatives of the common people who were voted into power by those same people. The House of Lords essentially acted as the Senate from Berengar's previous life and comprised members of the nobility who were voted into power by the nobility. Under this system, there were strict voting requirements. First and foremost, one had to be a citizen of Kufstein. Second, they had to be male. Thirdly, they had to pass a literacy test. And finally, they had to be a full-blooded German, which all of his citizens were, because this was not exactly an era of globalism. Though Berengar had desired to create a semi-constitutional elective monarchy in the future which afforded representation to both the nobility and the common population, he was by no means an egalitarian. Much like America, the territory that was currently known as the Viscounty of Kufstein would be split into more localized districts presided over by a similar form of local governance as America from his past life. with towns, town halls, mayors, etc. The districts themselves were ruled over by a governor who was elected by the commoners and the nobility of the region. As far as the executive branch was concerned, the seat of power was ruled by the Viscount, who after Berengar's death would be elected by the House of Nobles from among the male members of his dynasty. If for whatever reason there were no surviving male members of his dynasty, then the next ruler would be elected from the female members, and she would be required to have a matrilineal marriage with her spouse. This would ensure the power would forever remain in his family's hands, but hopefully, the most competent member of his family would be succeeded. If the current Viscount chose to abdicate for whatever reason, he was also allowed one vote to decide who his successor would be. His position as Viscount held significant authority. Like the president from America, he both signed bills into law, held power to pass executive orders, and was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. The difference primarily being the fact that his position was for life, or until voluntary abdication. Of course, Berengar did not forget to explicitly enact a separation of church and state within these reforms, thoroughly dissolving any influence the Vatican had over secular affairs within the Viscounty of Kufstein. This action would undoubtedly incur the wrath of the Vatican, but what else was new? Berengar was definitely pleased with how stable and efficient he had made things as he glanced over the forms for review. Obviously, these monumental changes would not go into effect immediately. To ensure everything progressed smoothly, this law was allotted a time span of 5 years for the complete transition of power. At the moment, these legal reforms were more of a declaration of his intentions on how he will proceed with the future of governance. However, these massive legal reforms would eventually become the basis of the constitution of the German Empire. He knew that by reforming the feudal system as early as possible, he could get the people in his territory accustomed to it. If he waited until he had an actual kingdom or empire under his command to implement these reforms, he would surely be fighting rebellions against the nobles for decades to come. Thus, he estimated things would go much more smoothly by starting the transition of power early on and incorporating the regions he would come to conquer into this process. When Lind looked over these legal reforms, she was absolutely shocked at his changes. Ultimately, she began complaining about the situation. As a girl who had grown up as a pampered noble, she could not imagine giving up unlimited authority for future stability. So you're giving up your power just like that? Berengar chuckled and patted his lover's head as he tried to explain his actions. It is true that with these reforms, I will not hold absolute authority over the lands, but then again, when my territories expand into a mighty empire, I will not have the time to micromanage every facet of society. Times are changing. When the common people become educated and are given more spare time due to industrialization, they will inevitably demand representation in the government. To deny it would invoke revolution. By taking the first step to ensure the people's future, and by giving them a degree of representation which they have never seen before, they will see it as an act of divine benevolence and will come to see that my dynasty is not a bunch of haughty noblemen presiding over them like cattle, but more like a shepherd defending his flock from the wolves. Lind was completely shocked by his vision for the future and the fact that he was willing to give up absolute authority for the sake of creating a stable monarchy ruled by his family for generations. However, when she read about the succession laws, she could not help but smile and cling to him with a vice grip. She interpreted these laws as a way to place her future son on the throne despite being a bastard, not realizing that although Berengar saw monarchy as one of the most efficient forms of government, the succession laws currently in place often managed to put the least effective ruler on the throne, which had often resulted in disaster in both this timeline and the one of his previous life. As such, his true intentions were that he was trying to mitigate such a result as much as possible. Nevertheless, the Viscount and his lover stayed like this for some time, as they discussed the future implications of his laws and his idea for a united German Empire. Berengar was glad that he had someone he could discuss his vision with. Until now he had never really discussed his plans for the future with anyone, but with Lind by his side, he felt as if he could say just about anything to her without her stabbing him in the back. Before long, Berengar was forced back to work. Many things required his attention, especially mass recruitment into public education. As usual, there was truly no rest for the weary. Chapter 95 Alchemists arrive in Kufstein. When word of his legal reforms spread across the land, it was not just the nobles who were his vassals who had become upset by the news. In fact, pretty much the entirety of the Austrian nobility was outraged by such wild and ambitious ideas. For starters, they were unsure if Berengar actually had the legal authority to do this. Technically, Berengar was a vassal to Count Lothar, who was, in turn, a vassal to the Duke of Austria. As such, it was entirely unclear if he had the legal authority to do away with the feudal system in his own territory. The second major point of contention was that he was essentially challenging the absolute authority of the nobility across Europe as a whole when the commoners of other territories heard that their counterparts in Kufstein were going to be afforded political representation and public education in Kufstein. One of two things was going to happen. They would either abandon the land in which they slaved away upon for the sake of their feudal overlords, or they themselves would demand representation in their territory and thus pave the way to revolution. Berengar's actions had not exactly made him any friends. However, there was really not much they could do about it. Rumors of him having the power to conjure thunder and lightning had spread across the German-speaking regions. Not only that, but Kufstein was a relatively isolated and fairly mountainous territory. It would be challenging to invade and would surely cost many lives. Needless to say, his reforms were woefully unpopular among the nobility of this feudal world. As time passed and word inevitably spread, Kufstein received many German peasants running away from their masters and seeking a better life in Kufstein. This massive influx in the population of Kufstein rapidly expanded his workforce and sped up the production of the Grand Infrastructure Initiative, increased the size of his army, and enhanced industrial productivity. Of course, the most important group who were attracted to the Viscounty of Kufstein by these bold new legal reforms were a group of fugitives on the run from the Church's persecution. These fugitives were alchemists who had invoked the ire of the Church, as men of science commonly had done in the past. Knowing that Berengar was branded a heretic by the Church, and seeing as how he had supposedly enacted legal reforms to separate the Church from the political power of the state in his region, these alchemists arrived in Kufstein under cover of the many peasants seeking a better life, which despite the protests of nearby noblemen, Berengar refused to return to their former masters. When they arrived in the growing city of Kufstein, the men comprised of this small group of alchemists numbering no more than a dozen were amazed by what they saw. The ongoing construction of the city walls set up in strange a star-like pattern, the large apartment complexes that were being built, the industrial sector which had technology they had never seen before, even the sewage treatment facility which was currently under construction had caught their eye. It was as if these men stepped into a land of technological marvels. Of course, after sightseeing for some time, they made their way to the castle's gates, which were guarded by men in strange attire and unknown armor who wielded what appeared to be a hand cannon, but the design was not like anything they had ever seen before. When they approached the guards, they were quickly stopped by the bayonets affixed to their muskets, with the deep gruff voice of the squad leader giving them a command. "Stop right there. The Viscount is not seeing guests at the moment." Fearing the unknown weapons, the group of fugitives quickly did as they were commanded while lowering their hoods, which revealed their faces. The man in front of them all was a tall and regal man who was in his 50s with a finely groomed set of gray hair, a matching mustache, and a monocle. The man quickly introduced himself and stated the urgency of his need to visit the Viscount. "I am Aldo von Passau, former court alchemist for the Duke of Bavaria, and these are my students. Please, I have urgent business to discuss with your lord." The guards immediately looked at each other and began to discuss whether or not they should allow this group entry into the castle. After all, Berengar had long since informed his men that if an alchemist ever arrives in his territory, he would very much like to meet them. However, they were also under strict orders not to let people into the castle at the moment. Ultimately, the squad leader decided to make an exception and allow the men to pass. If they were really who they claimed to be, Berengar would surely forgive them. As such, the group of a dozen scholars were led to the great hall where Berengar was currently working. Their arrival surprised the young Viscount as he stared at the uninvited guests. Before he could inquire about their identities, his guards properly introduced the men. "My lord, I know that you have given us orders not to allow guests into the castle, but these men claim to be alchemists, and as such, I thought you might like to meet them." Berengar's sapphire eyes immediately sparkled with delight as he heard those words, and a smile beamed across his immaculate visage. Finally, after many months, he might have a group of dedicated chemists working for him. The mustached man with the monocle quickly introduced himself to Berengar. "My lord, I am Aldo von Passau, former court alchemist of the Duke of Bavaria. I have traveled a long way to meet you. I wish to offer my services to you and that of my students." Berengar frowned when he heard this. He was quite skeptical about why a court alchemist of a duke would bother coming to a lowly place like Kufstein. As such, he decided to investigate. If what you claim is true, then why are you here in my domain instead of at the court in Bavaria? The man quickly explained his story, which was all too common for brilliant men in the medieval period. He was studying alchemy when he discovered some new advancement that the church declared blasphemy in their massive ignorance. As such, he was declared a heretic, imprisoned, and his research was stolen. With the aid of hidden supporters in the duke's castle, he escaped with his students and had been on the run since. He was quite lucky to escape. Otherwise, he most likely would have been burnt at stake. After hearing his story, Berengar thought it was plausible, but he wanted to confirm the man's story. As such, he would later task his spy network to determine if the man was telling the truth or not. If he were, then Berengar would gladly accept his employment. For now, he would provide shelter to the man and his so-called students. If they happened to be enemy agents, he would have no qualms lining them up against a wall to be shot. As such, he informed the group of his decision. Until I can verify your identities, I will grant you shelter here in my domain. If your identities are properly verified, I have no qualms about offering you employment, as I have a dire need for chemists. As for the consequences if you are lying to me, and seek to do me harm, well, I'm sure you can imagine them yourself. Aldo bowed gratefully to Berengar. He did not doubt that his identity and that of his students would be confirmed, and as such, had nothing to fear. Thus he thanked the local viscount for his gesture before being led away. I thank you for the kindness you have shown my student and me on this day, and I look forward to working for you. The only thing Aldo thought was strange was that Berengar had used the term chemist instead of alchemist. Maybe he had misheard the young viscount. With the arrival of a dedicated team of alchemists in Kufstein, Berengar would teach them actual chemistry and would be able to accomplish many things in which he was currently lacking. As such, he was brimming with excitement. He truly hoped they turned out to be who they claimed and that they harbored no evil intent. Chapter 96: Adela's Birthday. The day was quickly arriving for Adela's 13th birthday, and the excellent set of jewelry in which Berengar had specifically crafted for his little fiancée was complete. The set comprised of a 24K gold necklace in the Tudor style from his previous life, with finely cut black garnet gemstones, as well as an official engagement ring, made of a matching composition of materials, and finally, a pair of clip-on earrings, which was also made from gold and black garnet. Ultimately, when worn by Adela, it would be the most extravagant set of jewels in possibly all of Austria, and Berengar was greatly satisfied with the result of his craftsman. Lind gazed upon the magnificent jewels with a hint of jealousy as she looked at her own, which were exquisite in their own right, but not quite as grand as the set crafted for Adela, which were fit for a queen or even an empress. She could not stop herself from remarking the grand expense Berengar was making to appease his future wife. I see Adela is getting a costly gift for her birthday. Berengar flicked Lind on his forehead and gave her a strict order. Stop being jealous. It is only right that I spoil Adela. After all, she is to be my wife one day. As for you, I already have spoiled you more than enough. Though Lind continued to pout, she could not argue with his words. The sheer capacity of her wardrobe was filled to the brim with magnificent clothing designs and accessories in which Berengar had personally designed for her. Now that Berengar's parents had moved out, Berengar had taken the master bedroom as his own and moved Lind into the quarters with him. She no longer had to sneak around at night to spend time with him. If anything, despite being merely his lover, she was currently living the life of a wealthy viscount's wife. Ultimately, Berengar had one final request of Lind before he departed for Graz, and he knew Lind would not like the decision he had come to. As such, with a heavy heart, he addressed his lover with a serious expression. Lind, I have a favor to ask of you. Lind was immediately aware of his tone and knew it would be something she disliked, but she nodded, signaling that he could continue. Thus Berengar made his request in an authoritative tone. I need you to stay here while I visit Graz. It would be inappropriate of me to arrive at my fiancée's birthday celebration with my lover in hand. Thus I have decided to leave you behind. Promise me you will behave yourself while I am gone. Lind had not expected Berengar to leave her behind while he went off to flirt with another woman. Though she knew nothing would happen between the two besides some childish kisses, she was still perturbed by the idea of being left out. Despite this, she knew this was not actually a request but an order, and as such, she obeyed her master's will. albeit begrudgingly. "I will do as you command." Berengar could tell by the expression on the young woman's face that she was not happy with the news, and as such, he made her promise to lift her spirits. "I promise that when I return, I shall make it up to you." With this, Lind smiled. She knew she would be able to use his actions as an excuse to monopolize him to herself for a few days, and thus she was instantly amicable to the arrangement. After saying this, Berengar gave her a parting kiss before leaving the castle and entering his carriage. An entire company of cuirassiers was tasked with guarding Berengar as he departed to Graz. Needless to say, he was properly guarded in the event some conspiracy was to take place. After traveling for an uneventful 23 hours, Berengar and his caravan finally arrived at the castle in Graz, which currently acted as the capital of the county of Steiermark, over which the von Graz family presided. He was still a day early, but the von Graz family quickly greeted him as he arrived. Berengar immediately paid his respects to Count Otto von Graz, whom he had not seen since the engagement ceremony. "Count Otto, it is an honor for you to receive me like this." Count Otto returned his praise to Berengar. He was truly impressed with the boy's performance. It was not easy to expand the territory of a barony into that of a viscounty, and yet he had done it so rapidly that his liege did not have time to interfere. It was truly a remarkable feat. Looking at the strange armor and weapons in which Berengar's knights wielded, Otto was immediately filled with curiosity. However, it would be inappropriate for him to ask about the details at such a time. After observing the force, the Count welcomed Berengar into his home. "Viscount Berengar, the honor is all mine. I have heard of your exploits and am deeply impressed with your feats. To think that you would rise to such a level of power and infamy so quickly is quite astounding." It had been a matter of months since Berengar had changed his character. Yet, during this time the youth had crushed a rebellion, removed his brother as a threat to his future, seized his neighbor's lands, and ultimately succeeded his father. Of course, Berengar accepted the praise from the Count with magnanimity. "You honor me with your praise, Count Otto." The Count merely smiled and grasped Berengar's shoulder. "It is well earned, my son." After exchanging pleasantries with Otto, Berengar walked over to Adela, who was waiting patiently for her turn. After arriving in front of her, Berengar began to pet her head as he greeted the girl. "Adela, it has been some time since I last saw you. You have grown even more beautiful in my absence." As always, Berengar played the part of a charmer with his little fiancée, causing her to blush at his words immediately. Despite her reaction, Adela was still quite mad with him about his affair with Lind, in which she was almost certain of. As such, she muttered under her breath in a voice so low even Berengar could not hear it. "Womanizer, s." Berengar did not hear her properly and tried to clarify what she had said. "What was that? I'm afraid I didn't hear you." The girl quickly snapped out of her daze and returned to her normal cheerful self. After putting on a wide smile, she accepted the praise Berengar had given her. "I said thank you." After this brief reunion, Berengar entered the von Graz family's castle, which was significantly larger and more fortified than his own, where he spent the rest of the evening playing the part of a loving fiancé and a graceful viscount. Chapter 97 Adela's Birthday 2. The next day arrived with Berengar having slept alone in the chambers he was provided. He desperately missed the warmth that Linda's body had provided him these last few months. As such, he had difficulty falling asleep. After all, he was accustomed to spooning with his lover during the night, so much so that something felt horribly wrong without it. Berengar decided to make today one of his rest days and thus spent his morning lazing about in bed. It was not until 11 in the morning where he finally rose from his much-needed rest and got prepared to face the day. As a man who was accustomed to sleeping in until the break of dawn, he was pleased with the long sleep he had gotten, especially after considering how long it took him to fall asleep during the night prior. After arising from his bed, Berengar opted to take a bath and was extremely disappointed by the primitive wooden tub with linen cover, which Adela's family had used. This was undesirable, to say the least. It reminded him of the painful days when he had first reincarnated into this alternate Earth. Needless to say, he made his bath as short as possible as there was simply no way he was going to enjoy himself in such a pitiful excuse for a tub. Berengar spent the remainder of his free time getting caught up with Adela, who was deeply concerned about his ongoing conflict with the Church. She herself had personally studied Ludolf's manifesto and the teachings of Berengar's Reformation. Though she agreed with most points, she still felt that the church was not nearly as corrupt as outlined in the paper. Especially now that Berengar was excommunicated and condemned as a heretic, she felt it necessary to discuss religion with him now more than ever. Berengar, I worry for your soul. The Pope has condemned you as a heretic. Do you not worry about the afterlife? Berengar merely smiled as he embraced Adela into a hug. He was glad that she was concerned for him, but the truth was he did not believe in such things. At most, he would be reincarnated again as he had already experienced. If not, he would become food for worms, as he had previously thought before his brief experience with death. As for the existence of heaven and hell, he was certain such things did not exist. Nevertheless, he did not admit to it and instead tried to comfort the girl with a similar message he had delivered to the Pope in the past. The Pope may have the authority to excommunicate me, however, when I finally perish from this world and am set before the gates of heaven. Ultimately it is God, not the Pope, who shall determine whether I am worthy or not of entry to the kingdom of heaven. Though Adela wanted to complain, she knew his words were true, or at least according to the Bible. On the other hand, Simeon and many popes before him would surely try to convince her otherwise. Yet because she had read the Bible in which Berengar had accurately translated into German, she was convinced what Berengar spoke was the truth. After their intimate moment was over, Adela could overhear her mother looking for her. When she finally found the two of them, they had already separated, and Adela, in particular, was blushing. The Countess had a look of concern on her face but decided not to ask about the question in her mind and instead informed Adela and Berengar that it was dinner time. Quickly, the both of you, come to the dining room. It is time for dinner. Berengar entertained Adela and her family, as well as the other guests who had arrived. He currently sat at the dining table across from Adela, where all of the nobles who had gathered for this occasion were present. The food on the table was one of Berengar's recipes in which he had given Adela as a parting gift when she had departed from his family's lands. After eating such exquisite cuisine, he could not allow her to go back to her house's relatively bland medieval food. As such, there were all kinds of food across the table, ones to which Berengar was well accustomed. However, to many of the nobles who were visiting, this was the first time they had dined on such delicacies and were greatly shocked at the quality of the food. With one particularly fat noble giving his compliments to Count Otto. Count Otto, these dishes are delightful, you must share the recipe with me. Count Otto smiled as he drank from his chalice of wine. After finishing his sip, he responded to the noble who was one of his many vassals. I'm sorry, but I do not have the authority to do so. These recipes are a gift from Viscount Berengar and were created in his realm. If you truly wish to obtain them, I am sure he would be willing to sell them to you for a fair price. Berengar, ever the scrupulous merchant, could smell an opportunity he had not thought of before. Why did he not think of selling his recipes across the German world? It was absolutely brilliant. He could spread traditional German culture from his old timeline and make a profit while doing it. Even though it would not be nearly as profitable as his steel, textile, and arms trades. He had already planned to expand into the jewelry trade by showing off Adela's presence in front of the nobility of Steiermark. Yet, the Count had given him another source of revenue that he had not thought of prior. The fat nobleman quickly asked Berengar about the details of such a transaction. Viscount Berengar, name your price, and as long as you can fulfill it, I will buy any recipe you have. Berengar smiled, however before he could make his declaration, several other noblemen chipped in. Me too, I also desire such fine recipes. Eventually, the whole table had shifted the conversation to business, where Berengar sadly had to put a pin in their plans. We will discuss this later, now is not the time to discuss business. Though the noblemen were impatient, they could not deny Berengar's words and, as such, forced themselves to calm down as they enjoyed the food that was present. The remainder of the meal was fairly pleasant as Berengar chatted with the noblemen, and Adela chatted with the noblewomen who were all quite envious of her fiancé. On more than one occasion, one of the daughters of the noblemen who were invited approached Berengar in an attempt to win his favor but was quickly shut down by him. Berengar already had two women who fulfilled their roles perfectly, and he did not have the emotional capacity to deal with a third. As such, he made polite conversation with these girls but never once hinted that he was interested. Adela, of course, watched him closely, like a vulture, but she found that Berengar did never attempted to flirt with any of the girls who approached him, even some of the more beautiful ones. This greatly pleased her as she began to believe that maybe Berengar was not a complete and total womanizer, though she was still certain he and Lind were an item. As such, for the moment, her fears were dissuaded, and she enjoyed the evening of her birthday celebration. Chapter 98 Adela's Birthday 3. After finishing the meal, the guests for Adela's birthday all sat around for a while and discussed things with one another. Shockingly, the Duke of Austria had shown up to the occasion, alongside several of his children. This greatly showed how favorable Count Otto was in the eyes of the Duke. Duke Wilmar von Habsburg was the current head of the Habsburg dynasty and the ruler over the entirety of the Duchy of Austria. He was relatively young for a man of his position, being in his mid-30s. Despite this, he already had several children in their teens. One of his children who were attending the ceremony was a boy named Conrad, who was slightly younger than Adela and had been friends with her since childhood, where he held a crush on her for the longest period of time. Unfortunately, the girl had been sold off to her cousin by her wretched father for whatever reason. As such, he had to endure the humiliation of seeing the girl he most desired handed over to another man. One who he believed to be quite inferior to himself. Conrad was entirely unaware of Berengar's recent rise to power and his bold defiance of the church. He never really kept up with the politics of the realm and instead enjoyed his time with frivolities. As such, the boy decided it was time to approach the woman of his desires and see if he could win her over to his side. After all, who would want to marry a sickly fool like Berengar? I mean, there was clearly nobody at the party who remotely resembled the youth's description, and that meant that the scoundrel had not even bothered to show up to his fiancée's birthday celebration. Clearly, that must be a point of contention for Adela, which Conrad could use to win her favor. Adela, it has been a long time since we last met. I must say you have grown ever more beautiful since then. I heard you were betrothed to your pathetic and sickly cousin. Surely you must disagree with such a decision? I mean, after all, a lowly baron's son who does not even have the gall to visit his fiancée on the night of her 13th birthday is clearly not a match for a woman of your caliber. Berengar, on the other hand, watched the display of the boy slandering him peacefully as he sipped from the wine contained within the golden chalice in his hand and narrowed his gaze upon this little rat who sought to steal his bride from him. Any man who coveted what belonged to him and made a move on it would surely suffer his wrath, no matter what their position may be in life. As such, he became quite hostile to the hyena who sought to steal his lioness and approached the boy with his hand extended in friendship, as he introduced himself. I am Berengar, Viscount of Kufstein and Adela's fiancé. Who might you be? Conrad was shocked when the tall and strong man in front of him introduced himself as Berengar and as a viscount. Clearly there had to be some sort of mistake. As such, he looked over to his father for support, who merely stared at his own son as if he were looking at an imbecile. Seeing his father was not going to support him in this matter, Conrad decided to take the word of this man claiming to be Berengar and reached out his hand to accept the gesture. When he did so, the boy felt as if a vice grip had squeezed his hand. Conrad nearly yelped in pain as Berengar kept a friendly expression on his face while sending a clear message to the little rogue who sought to abscond with his woman. Luckily Conrad had managed to contain himself and responded politely to Berengar, hoping that his background would save him from further pain. I am Conrad von Habsburg, son of Duke Wilmar von Habsburg, and an old friend of Adela's. However, much to the boy's shock, Berengar did not let go of his vice grip and continued to shake his hand for another few seconds before releasing it. The sheer audacity to continue to threaten the boy after he had already made his superior position clear was something he could not fathom in his naive little brain. Fear instantly filled the boy's mind as he saw the sinister smile on Berengar's face and the authoritative look in his eye. Despite being in a much lower position than himself, Berengar exuded an aura of domination that did not go unnoticed by the other lords. Even Duke Wilmar gazed in curiosity at the foolish display his son was putting on. As if by the simple fact that Conrad was his son, the boy could steal this man's fiancée. The Duke did not even take Berengar's actions as a sign of disrespect to himself, merely that the young man was confident in his ability to protect what was his. This was not an act of arrogance but overwhelming conviction. The more he observed Berengar, the more he desired him as a member of his council. Despite his young age, Berengar was clearly competent, to say the least. Ultimately Berengar's little display of authority was broken up by Adela, who noticed that Conrad had been trembling in fright and thus glared at Berengar while tugging on his sleeves and pleading with a pouting expression. Berengar, he is just a boy, there is no reason to go this far to intimidate the kid. Adela's words wounded Conrad's pride more than anything else could have. At this moment, he finally realized that Adela had never viewed him as a potential partner. With her confirmation, he also realized that the man beside Adela really was Berengar, and he foolishly had attempted to swipe his fiancée away right before his eyes. After realizing the looks he was receiving, Berengar retracted his tyrannical expression and put on a facade that made him seem like he was joking the whole time, as he tried to justify his actions to Adela, who was still pouting. "I was just teasing the kid. There is nothing to worry about, right, Conrad?" The kid was grasping onto his own hand, which was now sore from Berengar's tight grip, and stammered as he tried to come back to his senses. "Why, yes, it was all good fun. I have to go now, Adela, I will see you later." With that, the boy returned to his father to lick his wounds only after suffering a humiliating defeat in front of all the lords and ladies of Steiermark. When Conrad finally reached his father, he was chastised for his behavior in the cold and monotone voice that he was so familiar with. "You overstepped your bounds, Conrad, that man is formidable, and you openly coveted his future wife. You were lucky he showed you respect for your position." Conrad began to throw a tantrum after being scolded by his father, which luckily went unnoticed by the surrounding nobles who were too busy conversing with Berengar and Adela. Showed respect for my position? He hurt my hand. Wilmar merely drank from his chalice with a stoic expression as he continued to lecture his errant son. "The fact that he did not break your hand after your pathetic attempt to steal his woman was more than enough respect." With these words, Conrad was instantly shut up by his father and sat in the corner in silence, rubbing his sore hands and reflecting upon his actions. Not only was he ever so slightly injured by Berengar, but the girl of his dreams so ruthlessly rejected him, and his father had chastised him for his actions. This was the most degrading day of his life. As for Berengar and Adela, they did not think twice about the occurrence after it had been dealt with. Even if the Duke wanted to pick a fight with him over teaching his son a valuable lesson, he would welcome it. Luckily for everyone, the Duke only felt respect for Berengar's actions. If the young Viscount had groveled when Conrad mentioned that he was the Duke's son, his estimation of Berengar truly would have plummeted. Chapter 99 Adela's Birthday IV. After conversing with the guests for nearly an hour, the dessert was brought out, which of course, was a giant German cheesecake, which was made from Berengar's recipes. Adela, who had witnessed Lambert's birthday, had followed Berengar's tradition and placed 13 candles on the cake, which were currently lit. Before the birthday girl had managed to blow out the candles, Berengar made sure to shout out, "Make a wish." After hearing his words, Adela made a wish in which only she would know the details of before blowing the candles out with a simile on her face. At first, many of the nobles were confused by the candles and cake. Still, it seemed fun, and they instantly desired to do it at their future birthday celebrations, especially among the younger generation. As for Berengar, he waited for Adela to receive her gifts before giving his last. She had received many expensive objects, from silk dresses to old literature. However, nothing she received would compare to the set of jewels Berengar would give her. After opening all her presents, all that was left was the gifts from her fiancé. Many higher noblemen smirked with disdain at Berengar, who only recently achieved status as a viscount and surely would not be able to afford a proper gift. However, when Adela received his present, which was properly wrapped, she could not wait to open it and see what was inside. Anxiety was filled on the faces of everyone in the room, as they wanted to see what kind of humble gift a man who had grown up as a baron's son and heir could provide such a high-class fiancé. However, their eyes turned to shock when they gazed upon the extravagant set of jewelry that was unlike anything the nobility had ever seen before. The look on Adela's face was priceless when she realized the gems were better than anything that her mother wore. Even the Duke was stunned at the magnificent display of the polished black garnet and gold jewelry. Of course, Berengar made the set in the colors of his house as a symbol of their future union. Before Adela could speak her praise, Berengar had pulled the luxurious ring out of the container and bent down on one knee before placed the gilded object upon the young girl's ring finger. After doing such an action, Berengar spoke to his young fiancée with a genuine smile spread across his lips. "Happy birthday, my sweet Adela. I hope all of your wishes come true." Hearing those words, Adela's face began to flush with embarrassment. During the romantic scene, Several feminine shrieks could be heard escaping the lips of some of the more envious young women in the audience. They, too, hoped that one day they could have a fiancé as handsome and generous as Berengar. Count Otto could not help but approach Berengar and inquire where he had gotten such an elegant set of jewelry. After all, his wife was giving him death glares over the fact that her youngest daughter now had even better jewelry than herself. Even his other daughters were giving the Count the stink eye. The pettiness of women was something that could not be avoided. Berengar, my son, where did you get such a majestic set of jewels? A slight smile spread across his lips. Just as he had planned, everyone in the room had taken the bait, and now he could expand into the business of jewelry. As such, he boldly proclaimed the origins of the jewelry for everyone in the room to hear. I had it specially made by the jewelers in my territory, though I was the one to provide them with the basic designs. It was the craftsmen of my industrial district who managed to create such a grand display of art. The words he spoke sent shivers down the spines of everyone in the room. Did he seriously design this jewelry? Just like how he designed the clothing in which Adela and her family wore. Immediately everyone wanted to do business with Berengar and the craftsmen in his viscounty. Even the Duke was surprised. This young man was not just an excellent statesman and a brilliant commander, but an artistic genius. Truthfully speaking, Berengar merely copied designs from his previous life and decided to make them with colors he thought looked best, black and gold. Aside from that, he left the rest up to the true artists of his territory. If he were to try to develop an artistic design on his own, it would be an unmitigated disaster akin to so-called modern art. He was more of a mind of science, engineering, and tactics than a creative type. Luckily, he had a good sense of aesthetics and photographic memory, so the designs for clothing and accessories, which he thought were beautiful from his previous life, were easy to replicate on paper. At the same time, the rest of the work was done by true craftsmen. While Berengar was addressing Adela's father, the now teenage girl grabbed a hold of his hand, which startled him. When he turned around, she had stood up from her seat and pecked him on the lips for all her father's vassals to witness. The action was incredibly embarrassing for the young maiden, but she managed to express the words deep in her heart. Thank you. It was blatantly obvious by how red the girl's cheeks were that she was extremely embarrassed by the whole situation. However, what Berengar said next nearly melted her heart. You don't need to thank me. It is a husband's responsibility to look after his wife. With those words spoken by Berengar, Adela was no longer angry at him for being with Lind, because no matter what relationship he had with the young temptress, Lind would never be his wife, and as such, Adela could hold her head high with pride. Thus at that moment, she had finally accepted the possibility of Berengar having a lover on the side. After all, she knew deep in her heart that one day Berengar would become a great man, and didn't all great men have some mistress? Chapter 100 A Passionate Speech. Nearly 6 months had passed since Adela's birthday, and Berengar had long since returned to his home, where he continued to oversee the construction of his city, the transition of power, the expansion of his armies, and of course, the progress of industry. It was now winter, and Berengar stood in the middle of his newly constructed Reichstag, which operated as the chamber for his House of Commons. Seated within the room were the many men who had been deemed intelligent, capable, and charismatic enough to represent the interests of the common people of Kufstein. The young Viscount was giving a powerful speech to the lower house of his legislative branch about Kufstein's achievements since his father had voluntarily abdicated, leaving him control of the entire territory. Over the past several months, we all have worked tremendously to enrich further the lands in which we call home. Thanks to the chemistry department, we have been able to refine a large amount of TNT, which has been instrumental in rapidly expanding the operations of the many mines within the Viscounty, which have fueled our growing industries, bringing us a significant degree of autonomy and wealth. The ears of the commoners who were now elected officials of Kufstein's transitional government listened intensely to Berengar's impassioned speech, carefully paying attention to each word spoken as if it was being uttered from the voice of God. The mighty walls which shall secure the future of the city of Kufstein have been fully erected, constructed from steel-reinforced concrete blocks. They shall provide safety and security for every citizen who dwells within them for many years. Several of the congressmen nodded in approval. The investment into the walls was considered of dire importance and had been the first among many rapid changes that have come to the region. As far as defense is concerned, we have amassed 3 whole infantry battalions, 2 entire artillery battalions, and a full cuirassier battalion to act as the first field army of Kufstein. Forts have been constructed among the inhabited regions of the Viscounty and are fully garrisoned, as is the city, thus adding a great degree of protection to the lands and its people. I dare say the city of Kufstein could be laid siege to by an army of 100,000 men, and we would still be the victors. The House of Commons was all too familiar with the army's funding and was fully supportive in the endeavor. Even though the government was originally supposed to be a mixture of the USA and Great Britain from Berengar's previous life, the constitution was already redrafted 4 times to the point where it now greatly resembled the constitution of the German Empire from that timeline. However, the primary differences being in regards to the degree of authority in which the head of state held, which was significantly more than the Kaiser from Berengar's past life, and the succession laws which remained elective, albeit with more protections in place to ensure a peaceful transition of power from one viscount to the next, and to avoid any form of corruption within the electorate. In essence, Berengar still held significant authority as the viscount and could do practically whatever he wanted as long as it was within reason. In truth, the parliament acted more as a means to alleviate the heavy burdens of work that Berengar had to endure rather than act as a way to limit Berengar's authority. Berengar continued his fervent speech as he began to transition from the topic of defense to that of housing. Thanks to the ongoing efforts of our construction team, a series of affordable and comfortable tenements have been erected to reduce the horrendous conditions in which the common people have had to endure as a result of our rapid increase in population and urbanization. With proper plumbing and sanitation, we have significantly reduced the risk of an outbreak of a dangerous disease. Every one of the members of parliament had a look of pride on their faces as many of their families were living in these wonderful apartment complexes, which had sprawled up and replaced the slums in which the city had previously been plagued with. They continued to listen to Berengar as he moved on to the topic of agriculture. Our agricultural initiatives have proven to be a resounding success as the serfs have been liberated, and the farmers who chose to remain in the fields have been given the tools and knowledge necessary to tend to their fields with a minimal amount of labor while resulting in the greatest yields possible. The harvest this year was multiple times larger than any in the history of Kufstein. As such, we have stored plenty of grain to sustain our population for the years to come. The last topic in which Berengar had addressed was the field of public education. Under the Department of Education, schools have begun being constructed in every inhabited region, and we have seen a rapid rise in literacy rates. We will continue to work hard to provide the knowledge and resources that both the young and the old need to succeed in the path they choose in life. As such, I implore every one of you to do your best in the upcoming year as many of these directives are still incomplete and will need your assistance. I ask this of you all so that we may turn this land we call home into a land in which we can all be proud of. With his closing statements, the entire crowd of Parliament rose to their feet and erupted in applause and cheers. Not a single man had stayed seated, as that would be a sign of disrespect to the man who helped transform Kufstein into what it is today. While Berengar was basking in the glory of his accomplishments, far to the north in the capital of the Kingdom of Germany, the time had finally come. The old monarch laid lifeless on his deathbed, his reign had come to an end. With his passing, the stability and peace he had brought to the Kingdom of Germany and the many fractured realms that it comprised of would come to a brutal end. When the pretenders who had sought to press their claims to the throne became aware of this information, the German world would be embroiled in the fires of war. No region was safe now that the king was dead, not even Kufstein. Chapter 101 Victory in the East. Lambert currently wielded his longsword with a great display of skill. He was currently locked in combat against a Muscovite heavy cavalryman on the ramparts of a large stone fortress. Lambert had long since earned his way into the Teutonic Order, and due to the favoritism the Grand Master showed him, he rapidly rose in the ranks. At the moment, he was leading an army of men to breach the walls of the Rus stronghold, which was laid on their path to Moscow. These last 6 months, the Teutonic Order had thrown everything at the Muscovites and was not far from seizing Moscow. Just when Lambert thought he had gotten the better of his opponent, the man slashed his heavy cavalry saber across Lambert's great bassinet. Unfortunately for the Muscovite, Lambert was covered from head to toe in steel plate and was completely unfazed by the attack. Instead, he managed to catch the Muscovite off guard, and by switching his grip to the blade, Lambert could land a murder stroke on his opponent's helmet effectively. After the pommel of his sword connected with the Muscovite's iron helmet, the man collapsed to the ground, where Lambert could get atop him and drive his blade through the Muscovite's iron mail veil, piercing the man's throat, sending him to the afterlife. After killing the man, Lambert looked around to see his men had cleared out the enemy position. At this point, the only area left with enemy soldiers would be the keep. Once they had forced their way into the area and cleared out any survivors, the fortress would fall into the hands of the Teutonic state. As such, Lambert rushed to the front of the fray and ordered his troops forward. Take the keep. Leading the way with a sword in hand, Lambert charged towards the keep's gates, which were barred from the inside. It did not take long for the battering ram to arrive, where Lambert and his forces busted down the door, revealing a group of heavily armored elites, clad from head to toe in the distinctive Russ mail and plate armor. Once the keep's door was busted down, a frenzied melee broke out as Teutonic knights and Muscovite elites battled it out to determine who would be the victor. Despite resisting until the very last man, the Muscovites soon found themselves butchered like common hogs, leaving the besieged fortress in the hands of the Teutonic order. Days passed while Lambert and his men cleaned the fortress of the signs of battle and reinforced its defenses. Lambert and his army of 2,500 men were left to defend the region. However, before long, the defenders of the recently captured fortress noticed the sight of Allied banners flying in the wind. The distinctive white field emblazoned with a black cross could be seen in extraordinary numbers carried by the many ironclad men beneath them. The Grand Master and his army had arrived at last. After seeing that the battle was already over, the Grand Master felt impressed by Lambert's abilities. He was truly an excellent commander, and the older man patted himself on the back for recognizing such talent. The Grand Master quickly rode through the gates of the fortress, where he got off his horse and greeted Lambert. "Brother Lambert, I see you successfully captured this fortress despite being greatly outnumbered." Lambert smiled at the praise from the old man who had aided him greatly during his time with the Teutonic Order. However, he quickly noticed the letter which was in the man's hands and inquired about it. "What is that?" The Grand Master handed Lambert the letter and briefly summarized its contents as the boy read it. The King of Germany is dead, and with his death opens an opportunity to get rid of the Berengar heresy. While the lords of the German realm fight among themselves for the throne, which is nothing more than an honorary title, the Pope has ordered me to send a force to mop up your brother's mess. Considering we will soon be ending this war, I have decided to dispatch 10,000 men with you at the command to put down your heretic of a brother." After hearing those words, Lambert's eyes glistened with excitement, and a wicked smile formed across his face. It had been nearly 8 months since he had been exiled, and he spent the majority of that time honing his skills in combat. He had never forgiven his family for what they had done, especially Berengar and Lind. He would never forget the humiliation he suffered at their hands. As such, he was more than eager to accept the mission. Thus he knelt before the Grand Master and spoke in a chivalric facade. It would be an honor. Though the Grand Master knew this issue was deeply personal to the boy, he did not care. At the least, Lambert acted piously, and in the end, that was all that really mattered. As such, he motioned for Lambert to rise as the Grand Master led him to the troops in which Lambert would be commanding. Not only were the 2,500 men already under his command among their ranks, but he was given a large number of veterans to take with him. It would take several months for an army to march from the borders of Moscow to Kufstein. During this time, Lambert would greatly look forward to enacting his vengeance upon his brother like he had planned for so long. After all, if the Pope supported him in his endeavors to end his brother's reign, then clearly God must be on his side, or so he thought. Unfortunately for him, Berengar had been rapidly expanding his armies over the past 6 months. Though he might be outnumbered when the Teutonic Order finally arrived with their first invasion, he most certainly would not be outgunned. Thus an army marched back to the fatherland with the intent to kill a heretic and butcher the people of his lands. From there, they would spread across the warring states of Germany and lay waste to as many heretics as they possibly could, such as the divine will of Christ. Chapter 102 Plans for the Future. After addressing the Reichstag, Berengar returned to his castle, which he lived in for the time being while his palace was being constructed. He thought deeply about the composition of his transitionary government. Truth be told, the current House of Commons and the House of Lords were not exactly large in number, nor were they voted into power. Instead, Berniger placed those who had proven themselves competent and understanding of his reforms into the position for the time being to act as a form of governance during this transitional period. At the same time, he would spend the next few years educating the population enough to allow for a proper vote. The House of Commons was filled with the commoners who already had a basic understanding of reading, writing, and trades. During the later part of the medieval period in which Berengar currently found himself, towns and cities had commoners who were not mere serfs and who instead worked in trades within the local community, and it was these partially educated people, much like Ludwig, who were appointed to work in his rudimentary parliament. In reality, the House of Commons comprised a dozen or two people whose current responsibility was to take some of the work off of Berengar's shoulders and act as a public face of political representation. As for the House of Lords, the men within it were far more educated and responsible for the overwhelming majority of work, at least for the time being. They were mostly comprised of the younger generation of nobility who proved to be more amicable towards Berengar's revolutionary ideas. Technically, these actions were legal under Berengar's so-called constitution, as he gave the head of state the power to directly appoint people into positions of power, including the parliament, as well as remove them, or even directly dissolve parliament as a whole, where he could then appoint whoever he wished for the position, or call for a re-election. After returning to the castle, he quickly found himself hugging Lind and the newborn boy who was within her arms. Lind had recently given birth to a son named Hans, who Berengar had officially recognized as his. However, he had not fully legitimized the child, as doing so would provoke Otto into dissolving the engagement he had to Adela, which he could not afford to do. Of course, this was a massive scandal in its own right, and Otto nearly broke the engagement anyway. It was only thanks to Adela and her insistence upon marrying Berengar that it remained in place. After embracing his lover and his child, Berengar kissed Lind on the lips and asked her the question on his mind. "How is my baby doing?" Lind gave him a sly look as she cooed the sleeping child before addressing Berengar's question. "Do you mean the child or me?" Berengar smirked as he responded to his lover. "I mean both." Lind smiled gently as she held onto her infant son before handing him over to his father. "We're good. Hans is an extraordinarily healthy young boy, or so Ewald says." Berengar smiled at the news. The last thing he wanted was his firstborn child to suffer from the same degree of frailty and illness that he had endured in his youth. Meanwhile, he thought to himself in the back of his head, "Mother, father, you finally have a grandchild. It is just a shame you will not be able to meet him." Obviously, he was referring to his parents from his previous life, whom he had left behind with absolutely no grandchildren to speak of. To this day, he deeply regretted how his fate had turned out in his past life. Yet there was nothing he could do about that. If he had not died in Afghanistan and transmigrated to this alternate world, he never would have met Lind or Adela, nor would he be able to achieve the great things he had already accomplished in this world. To Berengar, this was only the start of his legacy. After holding on to his son for a little bit, he returned the boy to his mother, who had a worried expression on her face. It had nothing to do with the child, and Berengar immediately noticed that. After placing the baby in his crib, Lind began to address the recent news she had received. "The king is dead." Berengar was not surprised by this news and was actually quite happy about it. This meant that his plans for conquest could begin soon enough. Of course, the first objective on his list was to seize Innsbruck and declare himself Count of Tyrol. As such, his first question was regarding Linda's family. "When will your father attack Vienna?" Lind did not have the slightest bit of guilt as she revealed her father's plans to her lover as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "He will march upon Vienna in a week. It should take him at least a fortnight for his army to reach the capital. By now, the Duke has already begun moving his forces to Bavaria, where he will fight with the Wittelsbachs for the title of king." Berengar nodded with a stern expression on his face before responding to the information. "Then I will march upon Innsbruck in a month. It should be more than enough time for the Count to have begun his siege." Lind wrapped her arms around Berengar and kissed him passionately as she conspired with her master against her father and her family. "Should I address you as Count Berengar?" Berengar laughed at the young temptress's response before flicking her on the nose. She could not wait to have another child. Unfortunately for her, Berengar was adamant about waiting at least 6 weeks after having her child before they could engage in their usual nightly fun. Seeing as Lind had not yet had her proper period of rest, Berengar easily broke away from her grasp. To avoid complications after the delivery, it was best to wait a while before engaging in such activity. Since Berengar wanted both of his women to live as long as possible, he chose to abstain for the time being. Thus he teased Lind slightly as he responded to her temptation. Not yet, I refuse to use such a title until I have gained it by right of conquest. Of course, by refusing her, Lind began to pout. Though Berengar had explained his reasoning for doing so, she still felt lonely without making love to the man she desired. Nevertheless, it was only for a short time longer, and thus the couple got ready for bed. Tomorrow was a day where Berengar would spend mostly with his troops, getting them ready for combat. His forces had grown substantially over the last 6 months, and he was confident in claiming the county of Tyrol for himself and putting down any rebellions that would naturally occur from the lords who swore fealty to Count Lothar. When the time came for Count Lothar to call the banners to war, Berengar would provide him with a force of mercenaries and a gift of gold to apologize for his absence. Though it would surely infuriate the man, it would undoubtedly be accepted. Thus leaving Berengar and his superior armies with the ability to march on Innsbruck. Though he was unaware that an army of Teutonic knights was marching towards his lands, that would not stop his plans from coming to fruition. Even if he were aware of their advance, he would still behave in the same way. After all, with the might of his guns, he could bring Tyrol under his control before they even arrived. It was the dawn of a new era, a German era, one where Berengar would crown himself emperor. Chapter 103 God with Us. The light of dawn shone through the castle windows as Berengar was quickly awakened. His child had slept soundly through the night, which was a rare occurrence at this point. Because of this, the man was finally able to get a good night's rest. Seeing as how he would be with the troops today, Berengar did not bother with his morning exercise and instead began to get dressed in his military attire. By now, his armor was comprised of blackened steel 3/4 plate that was gilded in the same gold pattern as his previous set. It came with matching gauntlets. The armor set even had an armored codpiece to protect his groin and a pair of matching rondelles. Of course, the codpiece was hidden beneath his Waffenrock. As such, he did not feel embarrassed for having such a piece of equipment. Berengar also wore a golden sash across his breastplate. The black and gold armor went over his matching Landsknecht attire. He still wore the feathered cap over the blackened steel skull cap. He wore a heavy cavalry sword based upon the British pattern 1788 cavalry sword, tied to his waist by a black leather sword belt with brass fittings. The sword itself had a gold-plated guard and a black leather grip that was wrapped in gold wire. The blade itself was made of Damascus steel imported from the East. It was initially designed to be his wedding gift, but seeing as that was a few years away still, Ludwig had gifted it to him for his birthday, which was in the middle of October. After dressing in his attire, he snuck out of his quarters, leaving his sleeping lover and child to continue their rest. He quickly found himself in the kitchen where he was prepared a set of field rations, after which he went to the castle's stables and mounted his trusty steed Erwin, where he placed a set of 2 pistols within the holsters on its saddle. After riding out to the field, Berengar met with Eckhard, who was already commanding the infantry in their daily drills. The infantry was fully equipped with the black steel armor and black and gold Landsknecht attire issued to all of his troops. Nearly a quarter of his troops were equipped with the new 1417 18th rifled musket, which had been rebored and rifled to accept the .58 caliber miniball projectile. Because of this, part of his infantry now had the ability to engage targets beyond 300 yards. They were formed into their own rifle companies and fought alongside the standard smoothbore musketeers. The combined tactics of riflemen and musketeers would prove to be an effective means of combat, at least until he could manage to have all of his muskets rebored into the new design. Over the past 6 months, the army had grown into quite the professional force, with its own officer class made up of a mixture of knights, nobles, and commoners. Seeing as it was entirely based upon merit, anyone could become an officer with the right education and training. Since he did not have time to set up a full-fledged military academy, Berengar had been making do with selecting rare talents and training them with his vision of early modern warfare. Eckhard noticed the Viscount approaching and quickly saluted him. The army which had been mustered quickly did the same. It was only after he returned his salute and gave his orders did the men relax. At ease, seeing all his soldiers standing before him, Berengar made sure to communicate his orders effectively. The king is dead. War will be upon us shortly. I trust you have all been properly trained in the past few months. As such, we will be setting off in a month. At the moment, our target is confidential. However, when the time to march comes, you will all be properly informed of our destination. Thus, I want all of you prepared for the eventual day of our conquest. I won't lie, we will be gone for some time, and many of us may not return. However, for the prosperity of the realm and your family's continued fortune, we must fight. God with us. The last part had been a war cry Berengar had stolen from the Germans of his previous life. He had made sure every soldier was aware of this battle cry over the past few months, and the moment he yelled those words into the air, the army of several thousand men echoed by responding with the same chant. God with us. As such, Berengar spent the rest of his day overseeing combat drills while standing alongside Eckhard, who watched the perfect display of tactics being conducted. Eckhard had a look of concern on his face as he knew of Berengar's plans. He and the officers were already aware of what was to come, and they had known for quite some time what Berengar's aspirations were. Eventually, the man voiced his concerns. We have 5,250 men. It is not a bad number, but if we are to conquer the county of Tyrol, we will surely be facing stiff resistance. After seizing Innsbruck, the lords of the realm will rebel against us. However, many of them and their professional armies will be off with Lothar's siege to Vienna. Their children will surely raise levies to defy our authority. Our numbers will be stretched thin fighting against every barony and viscounty within the county. By the time Lothar arrives with his armies, we will be fighting several small-scale wars across Tyrol, which will put us in a poor position. Berengar chuckled at Eckhard's concerns before brushing them aside and comforting his most talented general by clasping his shoulder. My old friend, what you say is true. That is certainly one possibility in which war can result. However, I am not concerned in the slightest. After all, I have an ace in the hole. Eckhard quickly realized Berengar was referring to Lind, and he looked at him with an anxious expression. You are going to use her to conspire against her father while he is besieging Vienna? Berengar nodded with a satisfied expression on his face, as always with the slightest direction. Eckhard caught onto his schemes. However, the old knight's next words were unexpected. That is cruel, even for you. However, what Berengar said next greatly shocked Eckhard. It was her idea. Letting out a great sigh, Eckhard admitted defeat before his lord and general. You two are truly made for each other. Though the old knight had great respect for Berengar, he vastly preferred when Berengar used the might of his armies to display his dominance on the field of battle, rather than when he schemed behind the scenes to lead his opponents into a trap. Nevertheless, Berengar could easily manipulate Lothar and his vassals into falling to his ploys with Linda's aid. As such, he looked forward to the upcoming war and the day he could proclaim himself count. Berengar gazed at the scene of his army's drills and grinned at the sight. He had a good feeling about the future. If God truly existed, surely he was on Berengar's side. If not, why else would he be dragged into this world and put into a position of power? Chapter 104 Call to Arms. Much like Lind had predicted, within a week, Berengar received a letter from Count Lothar informing him to rally his forces and begin the march to war. In the northern parts of Germany, battles were already being waged between the House von Luxemburg with the backing of their allies against the House von Wittelsbach. Duke Wilmar of Austria had already begun his march into Bavaria with the majority of his forces thus launching an attack on the Wittelsbachs while their main army was away. However, he foolishly trusted Lothar with the defense of the border in which Tyrol shared with southern Bavaria. After receiving the summons, Berengar had sent the mercenaries he had already prepared for the occasion to rally at Innsbruck, with a chest of silver and a letter informing Lothar of Berengar's temporary absence. Currently, Lothar was standing in the great hall of Innsbruck surrounded by the various noblemen who had answered his call to arms, where he was reading Berengar's letter aloud for all to hear. Dear Count Lothar von Habsburg Innsbruck, it is with a heavy heart I must inform you that I am unable to reach the rally point at Innsbruck at this time. Due to several complications, mostly due to weather, I cannot round up my forces in time to meet up with you and your other bannermen. As such, I have sent this small force of mercenaries and a trove of silver to act as compensation for my absence. I will rendezvous with you at the location of the target when conditions permit it. Sincerely, Viscount Berengar von Kufstein. The various noblemen who had gathered could not prevent themselves from scoffing at the contents of this letter. Clearly, the young Viscount was a coward, hiding behind his walls while the rest gathered for the future conflict. Many of these men had done business with Berengar and felt a great sense of disdain for the man who helped supply them with the equipment they needed to field their armies. A middle-aged Viscount was first to voice his objection to the matter. Does the boy seriously intend to sit back and wait for the battle to be over before arriving? Apparently, my estimation of the mighty Berengar was greatly exaggerated. The excuse of weather conditions was laughable after all these men lived in Tyrol and suffered the same conditions, yet they had all managed to answer the call to arms. Though some of the noblemen were happy with Berengar's absence, he was known to be an excellent commander, and they did not want to compete with him when it came to rising in the ranks when Lothar came to power. Lothar merely stood in silence for a few moments thinking over the reasoning for Berengar's actions, yet not once did he suspect that the young Viscount was about to stab him in the back and lay siege to his home while he was off at war. Thus he made an equally foolish decision as Duke Wilmar and permitted Berengar's behavior, as the old count decided he would permit Berengar to stay in Kufstein until his forces were ready for battle. Part of his reasoning for this was that Lothar had vastly underestimated the power of Berengar's armies. He was unaware of the vast military buildup which Berengar had made over the previous months, nor how well every one of his soldiers was equipped. Firearms were still a rare and primitive design at this point in history, and considering Berengar had done an excellent job of hiding the effectiveness of his muskets and cannons, Lothar merely believed he had a few peasant levies equipped with the not-so-impressive hand cannons. On top of this, Lothar had purchased all of the high-quality equipment from Berengar's professional forces shortly after the war with Kitzbühel, and due to how busy Berengar had been selling arms and armor to other forces, he did not believe the young Viscount had time to equip his own army properly. Lothar had little need for a bunch of under-equipped levies. This was a more sophisticated era of warfare where smaller armies of professional men at arms fought against one another. The days of massive hordes of peasant levies equipped with hunting spears and a lack of armor was long past. Thus he made a bold declaration in front of all the gathered noblemen. Forget Berengar. If he wants to hide behind his castle walls like a coward, then I will allow it. We march to Vienna at first light. The gathered noblemen all nodded with a satisfied expression. Without Berengar and his armies, they felt a lot more secure about gaining Lothar's favor. Though they were entirely unaware of the already strained relationship between the young Viscount and Count Lothar, thus they were unable to predict the vicious thoughts that Lothar was secretly thinking in the back of his wicked mind. When I am done with Vienna, I will come to root you out of your castle and have you beheaded for this act of treason. Clearly, the target of his vengeance was Berengar. Lothar had never forgiven the boy for spoiling his schemes with Lambert, nor had he forgotten the fact that he turned his daughter into an unwed teenage mother. Who would possibly marry his daughter now? He had tried to convince Berengar to take responsibility and marry Lind, but the boy was stubborn about marrying the von Grotz girl, and this by itself had made Count Lothar thirst for his blood. As such, Lothar spent the remainder of his waking hours going over his plans for dealing with Berengar. After all, by the time the Teutonic Order arrived in Kufstein, Lothar was certain he would be a duke. By then he could truly gather a great force to crush this little ant who kept invoking his ire. Lothar had no way of knowing that Adelheid had been sniffing through his office while he slept that night, looking for any semblance of a plot against Berengar. On behalf of her sister, she willingly worked with the young Viscount to overthrow her malevolent father. During that night, Adelheid found letters from the papacy informing Lothar that the Teutonic Order had already sent an army of 10,000 soldiers on the warpath to Kufstein and that they would be arriving in a matter of months. The girl rapidly copied the contents of the correspondence and sent it to Lind in the cover of night. Her father and his allies were completely unaware that his home in Innsbruck was already compromised by Berengar's vast spy network. These spies would have a role to play in the upcoming siege of Innsbruck, which would forever go down in history as a major event of Berengar's rise to dominance. Chapter 105: A Broken Betrothal. Adela von Grotz was currently standing in the center of the great hall of her family's house with tears in her eyes as she argued with her elder brother Gerhard von Grotz. Gerhard was a young man on the verge of his 20s and, as such, was a couple of years younger than Berengar. Being cousins, the young men shared some striking similarities in appearance. They both had a refined and regal appearance, being the personification of the ideal prince charming in the eyes of many young girls. They were both tall and lean while still being muscular, and they both had glamorous golden blonde hair. However, Gerhardt's hair was much longer than Berengar's and was not slicked back. Gerhardt, however, had his father's emerald eyes. If one were to state what Gerhardt's relationship with Adela was, it was that of an extremely overprotective big brother, to the point where many would label him a cis-con. He had never been fond of Adela's engagement to Berengar and had voiced his concerns to his father many times. The grudge between the two cousins goes back well over a decade when they were small children and had only grown over time. Until a year ago, Berengar was considered a sickly, indolent, pompous twit incapable of accomplishing anything significant in life. However, when this changed practically overnight, and Berengar started becoming exemplary, Gerhardt greatly approved of his transformation. Of course, his approval always coincided with his contempt. After all, he did not want to hand his little sister over to any man, let alone Berengar. As such, it was not long before he began to detest Berengar once more. Berengar had made many bold actions that did not sit well with a devout Catholic like Gerhardt. Berengar's open defiance of the Church, his spread of heresy, and his execution of the inquisitors was a far bigger deal to Gerhardt than any other members of his family. Berengar's legal reforms, which spat in the face of the old nobility, also managed to invoke the ire of the young regent. Still, all of those paled in comparison to Berengar's most recent revelation, which had crossed Gerhardt's bottom line and made him have a great sense of disdain for his cousin. Berengar's public declaration that Linda's bastard child was his own son etched a deep sense of hatred into Gerhardt's bones. Yet despite all of this, Adela had continued to support Berengar. Gerhardt could not imagine what sorcery Berengar had played to control his precious little sister's mind to the point where she had defended his scandalous actions and continued to support the idea of marrying the scoundrel. Ultimately, there was nothing he could do about the matter because it was an agreement his father continued to support until now. Gerhardt and Adela's father had recently been called to arms and were marching toward Bavaria with his armies, leaving Gerhardt in charge of his family's lands. As regent, the first action he decided upon was to rescind the engagement between Berengar and Adela. Something which greatly upset the young teenage girl. Currently, she was pleading with her elder brother to honor the arrangement with tears in her eyes. "You cannot do this. Just because you are regent does not mean you can go against father's wishes and end my engagement with Berengar." Enraged by Adela's insistence on supporting that womanizing rogue who was their cousin, Gerhardt screamed from atop the seat of power in Steiermark as he tried to get his little sister to see reason. "He has openly cheated on you with his little brother's fiancée, they have a child together, and yet he still intends to marry you and not the mother of his son. Why can you not see that he is a terrible person? He is completely and utterly unfit to take your hand in marriage." Adela had never been so angry before in her life. Her eldest brother's insistence on ending her betrothal was an obsession at this point, and she could not understand why he was so consumed with the idea. She curled her little hands into fists as she shouted at the top of her lungs. "You are not my father, and you are most certainly not the Count of Steiermark. You have no authority to do such a thing." SS. Gerhardt was on the edge of his seat with rage. He could not tell what spell Berengar had cast upon his little sister to make her so rebellious against her own flesh and blood. Then again, Berengar was also her own flesh and blood, but that was far more distant. The important matter at hand was that he had already made his decision, and as regent, he felt as if it was in his authority to terminate the agreement. "It is already done. I have sent a letter to that bastard informing him that he is not getting his hands on my precious little sister. Now I do not want you speaking to that villain ever again. Do you understand me?" Adela was so angry at Gerhardt that she had blurted out her inner thoughts, which greatly wounded the man's pride as a borderline cis-con. "Fuck you. I wish I did not have a shitty brother like you." With that, Adela stormed off to her room, where she laid face down upon her bed and cried her tears into her pillow. She could not believe her relationship with Berengar had come to an end just like that. She sincerely hoped that Berengar would not resort to rash actions, like invading her family's lands to take her hand in marriage forcefully. The more she thought about such a possibility, the more she prayed that Berengar would beat some sense into her crazy older brother. As for how Berengar would react to the news that his cousin Gerhardt had broken his betrothal to Adela, only time would tell. After all, he was the type of man who was not afraid to flex his muscle to get what he wanted. Ultimately, Count Otto's response to Gerhardt's actions would determine how Berengar reacted to the situation. Chapter 106: An Act of Provocation. A few days had passed, and the message from Gerhardt had arrived in Berengar's court as he was making preparations for his invasion of Innsbruck. Berengar instantly read the letter, and a smug grin spread across his face. When Lind saw the look on his face, she knew nothing good could come from it. However, she would not be doing her job as his spymaster if she did not inquire about the details. As such, she quickly asked about what had made Berengar express such contempt. What happened? Berengar patted Lind on the head as he walked over to where he left his chalice and took a large gulp of the beer contained within. Nothing much. That idiotic Sis-Khan Gerhardt has just proclaimed that as regent he is nullifying the arrangement in which our fathers had made betrothing Adela to me. With this news, Lind was shocked. She did not know of the heated grudge Gerhardt held against Berengar, nor did she know that the boy had an unhealthy obsession with his sisters, and as such, could not have predicted that he would behave in this manner. Knowing Berengar's fiery temperament and his willingness to do anything necessary to protect that which he has laid claim to, Lind was afraid to ask what his plans were, but in the end, felt it was necessary. So, what do you plan to do about it? Berengar chuckled as he calmly drank another sip of the beer from the chalice on the table before exclaiming his thoughts aloud. That is simple. I will reject his authority on the matter and regard Count Otto's words as absolute. Gerhardt may be a regent, but he does not have the authority to defy the Count's wishes. He is trying to act like me and failing miserably. During my regency, my father was not in any condition to make a public appearance. Meanwhile, his father is at war, so unless the man dies, he can easily undo anything Gerhardt has done during his tenure as regent. As such, Berengar quickly drafted a letter that would serve as an act of provocation towards Gerhardt. The contents of the letter were as follows. Dear Gerhardt von Gratz, S. My dearest cousin, as a man who has once held a similar position to that in which you currently occupy, allow me to educate you on the folly of your actions and why they are completely invalid. First and foremost, your power as regent comes from the fact that your father, Count Otto von Gratz, is the reigning authority within the county of Steiermark. Under his authority, he has granted you the power to protect his interests and manage his affairs while he is fighting our enemies. Your justification for breaking my betrothal to your lovely sister comes from the fact that I have taken a lover, which has resulted in a child. Despite this, your father has stated as early as 2 weeks ago that he would not end the alliance between our two families, which is currently held together by the aforementioned betrothal. As such, by declaring the nullification of the engagement between Adela and myself, you are openly declaring your intentions to violate the interests of the rightful Count of Steiermark and thus act as a usurper. As a sworn ally to your father, who is also my loving uncle, I will be forced by the alliance we hold to liberate the county of Steiermark from your usurpation. As such, I implore you to think twice about your actions before I am forced to march upon your family's lands and depose you. Sincerely, Viscount Berengar von Kufstein. Lind read the letter in which Berengar had carefully crafted with great astonishment. Noticing the look on her face, Berengar inquired why she looked so surprised. What? Lind approached Berengar and sat down in his lap while looking him in the eyes with a solemn expression before asking the question on his mind. You would not really go to war with your cousin over this matter, would you? Berengar, on the other hand, merely smiled and rubbed Linda's cheek with his hand before replying in a grave tone. I would gladly go to war with God himself if he sought to steal either of my women from me. Lind blushed when she heard Berengar's boastful claims, but seeing the look in his eyes, she knew he was being serious, which made her heart race faster. However, what concerned her most was the interference this would have with his plans to seize the county of Tyrol. If you go to war with Steiermark, what happens to our plans? Seeing the confusion on his lover's face, Berengar decided to clarify his position on the matter. When Gerhardt sees my threats, he will act in one of two ways. Either he will back down, like the coward he is, or he will call me on my bluff, and I will be forced to march on Steiermark. Knowing my cousin and his weak spine, the threat of an army at his doorstep while his father is away at war will be more than enough to make him rescind his intentions. If he doesn't, well, it is not like I said when I would invade his lands, Tyrol comes first. In some way, this was a small victory for Lind. Within her mind, Berengar had essentially said that his plans to invade Tyrol and seize her family's lands for himself, and by extension, she and her child were more important than the betrothal he had to Adela. This is not at all what Berengar meant, but he did not know the intricacies of a woman's mind for what man could navigate that stormy sea. As such, Berengar immediately sent his letter to Gerhardt. At the same time, he also sent a letter to Count Otto, who was bound to be in some field in Bavaria, hoping that he could put an end to his son's impudence before Berengar was forced to act. The letter contained all the necessary information about the ongoing dispute to get his uncle on his side. Either way, regardless of how Otto responded, Berengar would not take action until after he had successfully claimed Tyrol for himself and put down Linda's father and his loyal vassals. Chapter 107 Victory in Bavaria. Count Otto was clad in a set of Cherbourg-style plate armor, covered from head to toe in a combination of plate, mail, and gambeson, with a tabard displaying his house's mighty coat of arms. In his hands was a halberd which he used to great effect as he hacked down at the Bavarian defender, a man-at-arms clad in a Brigandine chest plate over a mail hauberk. He wore a visorless bassinet as he desperately defended the attacks of the middle-aged lord. Otto and his army were currently engaged in a field battle not far from the city of Landshut. Though his troops were outnumbered, he had used superior tactics to surround the Bavarian army in a classic double envelopment much like the one used by the Carthaginian army at Cannae. As such, the field had turned into a slaughter as the Bavarians were pushed together and butchered by the Austrian army. Berengar's family were renowned as warriors for a reason. This notion extended to his cousins and their families as well. Despite Sigurd failing to recognize his son's disputes, he was well regarded as a great warrior and battlefield commander, though he had been looking forward to the day he could ride beside his allies in warfare once more. The guilt he felt for his son's actions and subsequent exilement made him no longer fit for combat. As such, Berengar's father was not present in this battle beside his brother-in-law. Count Otto greatly felt great despair for this occurrence. If Sigurd were here, the battle probably would have had fewer losses. Of course, Sigurd was a vassal of Count Lothar and probably would have been stuck defending the Austrian Alps from the Bavarian forces located across the border. Nevertheless, Count Otto could not help but lament the absence of his brother-in-law as he struck down the man-at-arms in front of him with his mighty halberd. After finishing the man, he moved on to another nearby with his soldiers flanking him. The group of heavily armored knights descended upon the Bavarians like the Reaper, deflecting their shots with their polearms and heavy steel plate armor. Luckily for Otto, he had equipped all of his soldiers, bannermen, and knights with excellent armor from Berengar's industrial district. Because of that, their casualties were substantially lower than the enemy, even before they caught them in a trap. The banner of the Golden Swan flew in the air as the Austrian forces soon overwhelmed what little resistance the enemy could mount. Pressed from all sides, the numbers of the Bavarians quickly dwindled from thousands to hundreds. The enemy commander soon found himself surrounded by an army of steel-clad warriors cutting down his troops like ribbons. He could not fathom how the Austrians had managed to make such a large supply of Brigandine and plate armor. The expense was surely outrageous. Nevertheless, Otto and his men quickly cut down the men before them, pressing onward to the enemy commander, who was lamenting his decision to sally forth from the walls and protect the nearby agricultural town from the Austrian raids. By now, the Bavarians had lost most of their army, and what few remained kept being smashed against the mighty steel wall of heavily armored men-at-arms who continued to press them further and further. Spears, halberds, pulleyhammers, swords, maces, war hammers all descended upon the relatively poorly equipped Bavarian forces, severing limbs and crushing skulls as the deadly blows landed upon their foes, resulting in a sea of blood staining the snow beneath their feet. After a long drawn-out battle, the last Bavarian standing eventually fell to the onslaught, ending in an overwhelming victory for the Austrians, who had suffered minimal losses due to their well-equipped forces. As his men were cheering in the thousands for the great victory they achieved, Otto raised the visor of his great bassinet and gazed at the scene of iron-clad corpses bleeding onto the snow that covered the ground. The middle-aged count sighed heavily as he mumbled the words, "So this is the tyranny of steel? How can the enemy possibly compete with the sheer defense my army possesses?" Count Otto was stunned by the performance of his army in this battle. If he was angry at Berengar before for cheating on his daughter and having a bastard son in which he dared to recognize, he could feel the fury no longer. The alliance he had made with House von Kufstein had truly paid off in this battle as he suffered far fewer casualties than he normally would have if he had not invested so heavily in Berengar's steel and arms trade. The amount of steel in which Berengar was able to produce must be a miracle from God, for the middle-aged count could not explain it otherwise. While his troops cleaned up the battlefield, Otto returned to his camp, where he planned to celebrate his massive victory. However, before he could do so, he was approached by a small party of cuirassiers who flew the banner of House von Kufstein. When Otto gazed upon the intricate pattern of the armor designs Berengar's forces wore, he could not help but feel that his own magnificent set of plate armor was inadequate. Nevertheless, the horses still rode forward and appeared to have greeted the sentries of his war camp, who quickly pointed in Count Otto's direction. Evidently, these strangely armored men were here for him. What news could Berengar possibly bring him that was of such importance that he would send men into the front lines of war? When the lead cuirassier rode up next to Count Otto, the man saluted the count before speaking. "Are you Count Otto von Gratz?" Count Otto noticed the intricate brass pattern on the officer's armor and gazed at it with envy. The pattern contrasted perfectly with the blackened steel plate and the garish black, gold, and white clothing that was slightly visible beneath the three-quarters plate armor. After gazing in awe of the magnificent armor design, Count Otto eventually reclaimed his senses and nodded. When he did so, the cuirassier handed him a letter with the seal of House von Kufstein upon it. While doing so, the leading officer informed the count of a brief summary of what had transpired in his absence. "Viscount Berengar von Kufstein sends word of the dispute he is having with your son Gerhard and seeks your assistance." Upon hearing those words, Otto immediately read the letter. As he did so, his expression became increasingly sour before commenting aloud for all the troops nearby to hear. "That fucking idiot." Though this was supposed to be a great victory and a cause for celebration, it was immediately tarnished in the eyes of Count Otto by the foolish actions of his errant son. For some reason, the boy thought that he could do whatever he desired just because he was named regent. If this is how the boy would reign as his successor, then Count Otto was greatly concerned about the future of his realm. Count Otto was left with no choice but to send word back to Berengar, assuring him that the arrangement still stood and that he would be strictly admonishing Gerhard for his actions. The last thing he needed was for Berengar to invade his lands under the guise of securing liberating Steiermark from a usurper. Chapter 108 Marching to War. Gerhard looked at the letter in his hands addressed from Berengar with disbelief. He could not believe that the young Viscount was so bold that he would openly threaten to invade the county of Steiermark over the decision to rescind Adela's engagement. The justification for doing so would be solid enough to prevent anyone from coming to Gerhard's aid, especially in this time of turmoil where nobody would be able to spare the forces to help him retain his regency. However, this was not the most abysmal piece of news that he had received. There was also a letter from his father which openly declared Gerhard's decision to break the betrothal as invalid and demanded that Gerhard relinquish his regency in favor of his younger brother Heimeric. By indulging in his desires to keep Adela away from his wretched cousin, he had cost himself the favor of his father, who now deeply questioned his eldest son's capability as a ruler. This was simply outrageous. However, if he were to burn this letter and defy his father's demands, Gerhard would truly be acting in rebellion, opening the stage for Berengar to justifiably march his armies on Gratz and liberate the people of Steiermark from his territory. This was not something a spineless coward like Gerhard was willing to risk. As such, he admitted defeat and vacated his position as regent, allowing Heimeric to come to power and immediately declare all of Gerhard's actions null and void under the authority of Count Otto von Gratz. When Berengar received this news, as well as the letter from Otto, he was greatly pleased. He had settled this dispute peacefully while humiliating Gerhard for his unwise decisions. This was enough punishment for trying to get in Berengar's way. After all, whether or not Gerhard was a pompous fool with an unhealthy obsession for his sisters, he was still family, and as such, Berengar did not truly desire to see his head on a pike. The grudges between Gerhard and himself were not completely irreconcilable, unlike the ones he held with Lambert. It had been close to a month since Count Lothar had marched on Vienna, and the man was currently besieging the city, thus giving Berengar justification to act in open rebellion. Berengar wrote a letter addressing all the lords and ladies of Austria and informing them of his intentions. He declared Count Lothar a traitor to the realm, who took advantage of the current crisis to seize power for himself. As a result, Berengar would act by marching upon Innsbruck and seize the county of Tyrol for himself until a point in time where the Duke of Austria could appoint a loyal successor to the title. Though of course, Berengar had no plans to relinquish his claims to the lands of Tyrol. After sending letters to every corner of Austria, Berengar approached his lover and child and said his goodbyes. It would be some time before he returned to Kufstein, as his plans to lay siege to Innsbruck and put down the inevitable rebellions that would follow might take a matter of months to achieve. Nevertheless, as the commander of his forces, it was his duty to stand alongside his troops in battle. Berengar kissed Lind passionately as the two hugged each other tightly. After separating from one another, Lind encouraged Berengar to the best of her ability. As his lover, it was her duty to support her man in his ventures. Despite the worried expression on her face, she forced herself to say her goodbyes. "Make sure to come home in one piece." Berengar smiled with confidence and petted the woman's glossy strawberry blonde hair. As long as you stick to the plan, I should be back safely in no time." With that said, Berengar kissed his infant son on the forehead before departing from the room. After doing so, he found his trusty steed Erwin in the stables. He mounted the mighty beast before taking off into the snowy mountains of the Austrian Alps, where he would unite with his army before marching onto Innsbruck. After meeting up with his army, which was already mustered and clad in heavy winter clothing, Berengar rode alongside his officers at the head of the formation. Eckhard was among them. His plate armor was shrouded in a heavy fur-lined cloak while wearing a warm winter cap beneath his burgonet. His army was well equipped for the winter, and due to the extensive road networks Berengar had built across his territory, they would be able to quickly make their way to the Viscounty of Schwaz, which lie between Innsbruck and Kufstein. Riding alongside Eckhard, Berengar decided to ask his vice commander about the morale of the troops. "So, how are the troops doing? I mean, we are marching to war in the middle of winter." Eckhard smiled as he faced the oncoming wind, which was filled with a chilling breeze and particles of snow. Despite the freezing weather, Berengar had supplied his forces with the necessary equipment to minimize attrition. As such, Eckhard was quite warm, and so were his forces. They are ready and willing to lay waste to the enemies of their lord and commander. It is a rare sight to see an army marching in the cold with such high spirits. Probably because they all know of the power we hold and that not even the high stone walls of the castle of Innsbruck can prevent our swift victory. Hearing this news, Berengar felt satisfied. The morale of his troops was high despite the conditions they found themselves in. So much so that they were marching to the beat of a song in which Berengar designed to resemble that of Die Eisenfaust am Lanzenschaft from his previous life. However, this song was edited to remove references to the Teutonic Order and instead reflect the conditions his army faced. As such, it was a similar but unique piece of art in which thousands of voices joined in unison as they sang along to the lyrics, which Berengar had presented them. To his army, this solemn song that was originally designed in his previous life to represent the duty of the Teutonic Order now acted as a boost to the morale of his personal army. To reach Innsbruck, they would first have to march through the Viscounty of Schwaz. Though the Viscount of Schwaz was fighting alongside Count Lothar in the ongoing siege of Vienna, his only son was currently tasked with presiding over the region during his absence. As such, there was a possibility that Berengar and his forces would have to face an army of levies in the fields if he wished to pass through the man's territory. However, that was not of great importance. Berengar's well-equipped army would easily handle such a meager force, which would come at the most delay the inevitable. Chapter 109 The War for Austria begins. Currently, Duke Wilmar was alongside his vassals, including Count Otto, who had regrouped with the main army of Austria at Munich, to which they were currently laying siege. They were inside the commander's tent within the siege camp, where they were discussing tactics for the ongoing siege that had already been raging on for a total of 15 days at this point. While going over preparations for building a tunnel beneath the city walls, a messenger rushed into the tent with dire news in hand. "My liege, I am sorry for the intrusion, but the news is urgent." Seeing the distressed expression on the messenger's face, Duke Wilmar calmly responded to his uninvited appearance. "What news is so grim that you would interrupt my war council?" Noticing the unfriendly gazes of the vassals gazing upon him, the messenger instantly gulped his saliva while finding the courage to report the grave situation back in Austria. "Count Lothar has led his armies to Vienna, where he has taken up arms against you and besieges the city as we speak." Duke Wilmar's expression turned murderous as he heard the shocking news. He was not expecting someone related to his family, albeit distantly, to turn on him in such a manner. However, right when the Duke was about to speak, the messenger spoke up once more. "There's more." Duke Wilmar composed himself in a manner befitting a man of his position before giving the messenger an order. "Continue, S." As such, the messenger continued to tell the full content of the news he had received. Viscount Berengar has taken up arms against Count Lothar and is marching his army upon Innsbruck in an attempt to force Count Lothar's hand to return to Tyrol and defend it. The messenger then reported the message Berengar had sent out across Austria, and the frown on Wilmar's face turned to a wicked grin as he spoke his thoughts aloud. The boy clearly knows Lothar will not turn his forces around and is acting in a way to advance his position, but so be it. If he actually has the might to seize Innsbruck and put down the ensuing rebellion successfully, I will make him count. As for Lothar, Otto, you take your army and break his siege. I will reward you dearly if you can bring me the traitor's head. Count Otto bowed respectfully to Duke Wilmar before accepting his request, though it would be difficult as Lothar's armies outnumbered his own and were equally well equipped. He must perform the duty for the sake of the duchy and the rightful Duke of Austria. It will be done, my lord. With that, the stage was set for a series of massive battles within Austria. As such, the Austrians were now severely limited in their ability to advance their claim to the throne of Germany. Though it was not as if the other pretenders were in any better of a position. After all, the entirety of Germany and the regions in the immediate vicinity had become embroiled in conflict since the death of the king. Count Lothar was currently in a similar position as Duke Wilmar. He was currently laying siege to the city of Vienna, which acted as the capital of the Duchy of Austria. It was the seat of power for the Habsburgs, and as such, he sought to claim it for himself. He currently stood within his tent reading the letter from Berengar which declared his open rebellion against Count Lothar, and his official support of Duke Wilmar. In his other hand was a secret letter from Lind. After reading the contents of both letters to his vassals, he left it up for discussion as to how they will proceed. Throughout the entire conversation, Count Lothar remained calm. Luckily, his daughter was on his side, as he thought the love she had for Berengar could not replace the loyalty she had to her family. In Linda's letter, it was written that Berengar was blinded by ambition and had marched a very poorly equipped army onto Innsbruck, leaving Kufstein completely defenseless. She added that she would welcome her father's armies with open arms if they were to show up in Kufstein. However, the goal was to take Vienna. After all, if Lothar abandoned it now, he would never get another chance to become duke and would most likely have to fight a full-fledged civil war with Duke Wilmar, the result of which leaned heavily in the favor of the duke. However, due to how poorly defended Kufstein appeared from Linda's description, Lothar could not help but take the bait. As such, he decided on a course of action while his vassals were screaming at each other with how to proceed. Viscount Theodoric, I want you to take a quarter of our army and march on Kufstein, securing the region and my daughter. You should not face any resistance now that she is in charge. We will make sure that bastard Berengar and his loathsome forces have no home to return to. With that said, Theodoric grinned from ear to ear with a wicked smile. He would now be able to ransack Kufstein and seize anything of value for himself. This was also his chance to get close to Lind, who he had desired since she was a little girl. After all, she was considered one of the 3 heavenly beauties of Austria. As for Berengar's bastard son, he planned to drop it from the roof of the castle. Thus he was more than happy to accept the offer as he bowed before Count Lothar. You can count on me, my lord. With that, Count Lothar's armies were severely weakened overnight as a quarter of them would soon march into a trap Berengar and Lind had come up with, completely unaware that they would soon be facing impregnable defenses mounted on all sides with 24-pound siege cannons and a garrison armed with muskets. As for Lothar, he had greatly weakened his position, completely unaware that Count Otto was marching with his full force to lift the traitor's siege. Whether or not Count Lothar survived the ordeal was determined by how quickly he could take the castle in Vienna and hold the duke's family hostages. In a single move, Lind had greatly weakened the position of Berengar's enemies, all while Berengar and his army were marching through the Alps to lay siege to the capital of Tyrol, the city of Innsbruck. One thing was certain: the war for Austria had just begun, and it would become a long and brutal war with an unexpected victor. After all, both the Duke of Austria and the rebel count were currently in the middle of a siege, where anything could happen, and lives were easily lost. Chapter 110 Enemy Ambush. Berengar and his forces had arrived in the Viscounty of Schwaz after a few days' worth of marching. Obviously, they had made camp throughout the nights. Berengar was trying to lose as few forces as possible to attrition. As such, he had kept his forces far from exhaustion and well-fed, hydrated, and equipped to combat the effects of the cold. To him, every one of his soldiers was a precious member of his society. Those lost were not easily replaced without his land suffering from it. War was necessary for expansion, but he did not want to fight a war without regard to his soldiers' lives. As such, they marched at a safe pace. Berengar was currently on watch for the night. One of the men who were on patrol had gotten too cold, to the point where his health was beginning to suffer. Berengar, who was passing by, offered to take his place. As such, the Viscount and commander of the army was standing on watch with a group of foot soldiers. Berengar decided to break the ice with the simple infantryman to whom he was standing aside. "So, what are your names?" The two men looked at each other with odd expressions before answering Berengar's question as if it were coming from the commanding officer and Viscount of Kufstein. "My lord, I am Private Arnwald, and this is Private First Class Bardo." Berengar spoke in an informal tone as he addressed the men. "I am Berengar, though I suppose you already knew that." The two men nodded as they gazed at Berengar in awe. Berengar was more than just their lord and commander, he was close to a legend. His childhood infirmity was well known, even among the ranks of his army. Yet, despite all of that, he had risen above such circumstances after 20 long years of suffering, only to be plotted against by his own brother, surviving numerous attempts on his life, including a rebellion by Lord Ulrich where he was able to rise to the position of regent and crush his neighbor, expanding his family's territory to the level of a viscounty. The two men nearly nodded their heads in silence, afraid to say something that might offend the man they looked up to. However, before the conversation could continue, Berengar spotted what appeared to be a shimmer not far away under the bright full moon in the sky above. He patted Private Arnwald on his shoulder with a grave look on his face and commanded the man with a tone filled with authority, immediately dropping his informal speech as he did so. "Private Arnwald, I need you to sound the alarms as quickly as possible." Arnwald did not know why Berengar was so serious, but an order was an order, and he would be damned if he failed to fulfill it. The man saluted Berengar by pounding his chest before running off to do as he was commanded. "As you command, my lord." After Arnwald ran off, Berengar unsheathed his sword and aimed it in the direction of the darkness ahead. While doing so, he chatted with Bardo. "I really hope that musket of yours is loaded, we might need it in a few seconds." Though Bardo had not detected anything in the vicinity, he quickly unslung his musket and fixed the bayonet where he proceeded to cock the action and aim it directly in front of him. Though the man did not know what Berengar had detected, he trusted his commander's senses, and as such, was prepared to hold the line until the men were ready to defend the camp. Shortly after Berengar and Bardo's actions, the ringing of a bell echoed across the field, which awoke every man in the camp. By ringing the bell 3 times, it signaled an enemy attack. As such, the men did not even bother equipping their armor. They immediately grabbed their muskets and web gear before heading out of their tents and into the fray. When the enemy hiding in the darkness heard the bell ring, they quickly began to rush the camp they had surrounded. Knowing that their cover was blown, they sought to rush Berengar and his forces as quickly as possible. Luckily, these men were mostly formed of levies and were poorly equipped. When the levies near Berengar's position rushed upon him and the man next to him, the thunder of Bardo's musket could be heard across the field as the lead ball shot through the levy's chest, which was directly in front of him. In the darkness of the night, a battle had begun within Berengar's encampment. The forces left behind in the Viscounty of Schwaz had located Berengar's camp and decided to attack in the night. Berengar adeptly wielded his sword. Having trained in its use for hours every day for the past 8 months, he was adept enough in swordplay to overcome the advancement of the levies. With a lunging thrust, Berengar pierced through the gambeson shirt of the levy in front of him and into the man's heart, adeptly avoiding the man's spear as he did so. Berengar and Bardo were quickly pushed back into the camp by the overwhelming numbers of the enemy forces. When they reached a certain point, Berengar heard a voice shout at him. "My lord, get down now." Quickly adapting to the situation, Berengar dragged Bardo down with him into the prone position where a volley of musket fire decimated the front line of the enemy's forces. Before the enemy levies could react, the musket line kneeled and reloaded their rifles. In contrast, the second line behind them fired another volley over their heads, completely shredding the lightly armored levies and breaking their morale. This action had bought Berengar and Bardo some time to reform their ranks among the men who had just arrived to support them. As such, Berengar dragged Bardo to his feet and rushed behind the firing line, which had already reloaded, and began to fire another volley into the ranks of the enemy forces who were utterly shocked by the unknown weapons in which they were facing. All across the camp, the sound of musket fire and agonizing screams echoed through the night as Berengar and his men desperately defended against an enemy ambush. Despite the fire of the muskets breaking the enemy ranks, a few of the men managed to rush towards Berengar and his unarmored men whose bayonets were already fixed. As such, they dropped their actions of reloading and began to engage in the fray with the enemy. Luckily for them, the enemy was equipped with spears and was limited to the same degree of thrusts in which Berengar and his forces were, the primary difference being the level of training between Berengar's professional army and the peasant levies who had seldom stepped foot on a battlefield before this moment. Because of the difference in training and the strict military hierarchy in which was established among Berengar's forces, the men under his command were quickly able to funnel the enemy's forces into the small gaps in the camp's defenses, where they were met with lines of bayonets easily able to cut them down. By the time the sun rose, the camp scene below was filled with the blood and bodies of the enemy, which was littered across the snow. Though Berengar's army had suffered a little over 100 casualties, his losses could be considered minimal. On the other hand, the enemy's forces were nearly annihilated. Those who had broken ranks and ran into the night were lucky to have survived. One thing was certain: Berengar's target was no longer Innsbruck. He would first lay siege to the castle in Schwaz. After succeeding in his endeavors, he would annihilate the Viscount's family as an act of retribution on behalf of the soldiers lost in this battle. Chapter 111 Memorial Service. After a long night of bloody struggle, Berengar stood at attention before his troops, who were now fully dressed in their battle attire, with their muskets slung over their backs. Currently, the men that comprised of his army were holding a brief memorial service for the men who died the night before. Between 100 to 200 men had perished in the ambush from the previous night, and while the enemy's forces were nearly annihilated by Berengar's army, Berengar felt nothing but sorrow for the lives of his fallen soldiers which were lost in the conflict. Unlike most generals, Berengar deeply cared for the lives of the men under his control and tried his best to mitigate losses. Every soldier lost meant that someone from his workforce would have to take their place, which decreased productivity. War was necessary for the expansion of a state, and thus benefiting the nation that enforced their demands in the long term. The short-term costs were something every leader must become accustomed to. Still, it was not an easy responsibility to bear. If Berengar had deigned to mind his place in the world and sit back in Kufstein and peacefully flourish as he had initially planned, then these men most likely would not have lost their lives so early. Yet, these lowly ambitions could no longer contain Berengar's growing desire for power. As a man who had very little in his previous life in terms of authority and wealth, the moment he tasted true power for the first time, his thirst for supremacy became unquenchable. Despite his relative benevolence when compared to monarchs of the past, Berengar was still a man. Like all men, he was inherently prone to the corruption brought forth by absolute power. In his old life, there was a saying, "Absolute power corrupts absolutely." While Berengar had grown increasingly malicious towards his potential enemies, he was still compassionate to his loved ones and those he was responsible for. However, now was a time of war, and he could not give a warm-hearted speech about how great the men who perished the night before were. No, Berengar knew he had to inflame his soldiers' desires for vengeance, and as such, the speech he touted as the fallen soldiers were laid to rest was one of fire and fury. "I look upon every one of you are standing here before me, and I see men who have given up everything to fight the enemies of Kufstein courageously. Please make no mistake, the men who ambushed us last night may have been mere peasants drafted into service to fight against us, but they were still the enemy. They chose to ambush our camp while we slept, and they chose to kill over 100 of our brothers in arms. These men who have perished have fallen defending their comrades, their officers, and their lord. Henceforth I decree that the family of any man who dies honorably in battle shall be given exemption from taxes for a duration of time. I am certain that the men who have perished on this day desire but one thing from all of you, and that is to avenge their deaths. So I have decided before we march on Innsbruck, we shall lay siege to the castle of Schwaz and root out the man responsible for this attack. I promise to have him and anyone else deemed responsible beheaded, where their heads may be mounted on pikes outside of the ruins of their once mighty castle. God with us." Having finished his speech, the men gathered before him, numbered in the thousands, all began to chant the battle cry repeatedly. "God with us." As they did so, the honor guard fired a volley into the air after the men were fully interned in the graves below. Berengar vowed to build a memorial upon this spot for the men lost in this battle when he finally won this war. Seeing that he had now stoked the flames of vengeance in the hearts of his soldiers, he gave an order to his troops. Now, pack up camp, and set forth for the city of Schwaz. Now is not the time for tears, now is the time for battle. May God show mercy to our enemies, for we will not. With that said, the army began to gather their equipment and pack up the siege camp. Within an hour, the army of over 5,000 men was once more on the march. The city of Schwaz was nearby and had invoked the ire of Berengar and his troops. Though Berengar would not harm unarmed civilians, those who resisted his conquest were considered enemy combatants and would suffer the same fate as the defenders. Nobody expected Berengar to lay siege to Schwaz on his way to Innsbruck. Though this would give his enemies time to rally against him, it ultimately would not matter, for the power of steel and shot was not something these feudal armies could easily contend with. It would be quite some time before his advanced weaponry became known to all, and even longer before anyone had successfully replicated it. For the time being, Berengar's armies would become the most dominant force on the European battlefields. Schwaz was merely the first of many battles that would take place over the coming months as Berengar began his conquest of Tyrol. While his armies marched to Schwaz, another army was marching towards Kufstein. Though it would be a couple of weeks before they arrived, their intentions for Kufstein and its people were far viler than anything Berengar had in mind for his enemies. As winter raged across the Austrian Alps, more than one army was on the march. The war for Austria had already begun, and time was of the essence. Luckily for Berengar and his forces, he possessed the power of gunpowder and could easily render the once mighty walls of castles to ruin in a matter of days. His 12-pound cannons gave him an enormous advantage when it came to siege warfare, something which he would demonstrate to the world shortly. Chapter 112 Agents in the Shadows. Lind sat near her infant child, who was currently sleeping in his crib. Though she had no way of knowing what kind of man her child would eventually grow into, she truly showed unconditional love to the child, so clearly, he would turn out well, would he not? Despite being an infant, the child was born with a full head of strawberry blonde hair like his mother, and his eyes were sapphire like his father's. Lind knew that one day her child would grow to be a great and powerful man like his father, but the extent to which he would accomplish remained unknown, for mankind did not possess the power to see the future. As Lind watched over her child, she received a trio of letters. One was addressed from Berengar, one composed by her half-sister Adelheid, and the final letter was written by her father, Count Lothar. She read over the contents of each letter with a smile on her face. Berengar's letter contained information that he was laying siege to Schwaz after surviving an ambush from the local regent's levies. This shift in plans was not important to her, as Berengar would most likely have to wipe out the Viscount's son after seizing Innsbruck anyways, as the young man was sure to rebel against Berengar. As for the letter from Adelheid, expressed a plan the girl had hatched to allow Berengar to seize the castle without laying siege to it. Adelheid was greatly concerned about the possibility of the walls being brought down and her defenses with it. After all, Lind had communicated to her half-sister the effectiveness of Berengar's cannons. The plan was actually brilliant, and as such, Lind would later write a letter to Berengar informing him of her sister's plot so that he could take the castle at Innsbruck with ease, thus allowing him the benefit of having fully functional walls while he waited for the enemy to make their move. As for the letter by her father, contained information regarding the army he was sent to seize Kufstein and how Theodoric was leading it. Immediately upon reading that name, Linda's smile turned into a frown. She could not help but voice her concerns. When that lecherous old fool comes to Kufstein, I will make sure he is the first to die from the cannon's bombardment. She was all too aware of Theodoric's proclivities. He was a lecherous man particularly attracted to young women and girls. The old man also had a penchant for sacking every city he laid siege to. Undoubtedly, if Lind were actually to let Theodoric into her lover's city, the man would ransack the city and potentially attempt to force himself upon her. As such, she wanted the garrison to target their explosive shells on his position when his army arrived. After all, it was a common practice to wear a tabard with one's coat of arms emblazoned upon it during this time. He would be easy to scout from among the enemy's forces. Thus Lind spent some time drafting letters to Berengar to relay the information she had received from bothering her sister and father. Once finished, the letter was dispatched with a messenger to ride towards Berengar's encampment outside of Schwaz, where it would be delivered to him, hopefully before the might of his guns completely brought the city down. After finishing with her letters and spending time watching over her sleeping son, Lind got to work. gathering several intelligence operatives beneath her command. These hands were the best among her saboteurs and assassins. They were equipped with a revolving flintlock pistol based on the collier pattern design from Berengar's previous life. These weapons were best used outside of the battlefield as the cylinder had to be manually cycled, and the reloading speed was atrocious. However, they were excellent for personal defense and had been specially constructed for use among Berengar's operatives. Lind had begun to address the operatives known as hands as they were gathered before her in secret. I have a task for you all to fulfill. I won't lie, it will be dangerous, but with advancements in technology over the last 6 months, particularly in the field of chemistry, you have a much higher chance of returning with your lives. One of the head operatives who, like his comrades, were currently shrouded by a hooded cloak spoke up from among their ranks. What is it that you require of us, listener? Lind smirked as she heard her shadowy title before giving her decrees to the well-trained agents of Berengar's spy network. I need you to infiltrate the various baronies and viscounties throughout Tyrol. Your objective is assassination and sabotage. Take out high-profile targets, sabotage the food stores of the cities, as well as strategic positions such as key defensive structures. With the use of TNT, you will have a much greater chance of destroying enemy fortifications. The purpose of these actions is to provoke the enemy lords into marching upon Kufstein, or Innsbruck, where Berengar will have seized soon enough. I want them so infuriated that they will feel that they have no choice to end their misery unless they personally take action against our liege, thus allowing Berengar to trap them with his armies. The same agent who had spoken up before nodded his head while answering Linda's assignment with the affirmative. It will be done. With that, the qualified agents of Berengar's growing spy network were set to the task. As for the remainder of the Viscount's operatives, they would be assigned to counter-espionage operations within Berengar's lands. As such, the war of intrigue that was waged behind the scenes of the war for Tyrol had begun. The other lords and ladies of the realm were no longer safe in their own castles against the shadowy agents of Berengar's vast spy network, as they would soon come to find out. Lind felt it was necessary to take action on her man's half. While Berengar was off at war as the valiant commander, Lind would handle the dirty work within the shadows. Thus the couple expertly complemented one another when it came to matters of war and intrigue. Soon enough, all of Germany would be caught in their collective web. Chapter 113 Siege of Schwaz. Berengar was currently sitting outside the city walls within the confines of his siege camp. He was having breakfast, which consisted of rye crackers and salted pork. He ate the same food as his soldiers and refused to have special treatment while in the field. As such, he was sitting next to an officer, an NCO, and an enlisted soldier. The cannons echoed across the field as they continuously bombarded the city walls. One might think a thunderstorm occurred if they were not accustomed to such advanced weapons. Though the skies above were gloomy, and the cold breeze was filled with falling snow, it was by no means a thunderstorm. The cool breeze whipped across Berengar's face, which was the only portion of his skin that made direct contact with the air. He was covered from head to toe in thick fur-lined wool clothing like the rest of his troops. Actually, Berengar's army's attire was far less garish in the winter. With a set of winter boots and gloves, they looked far different than their field equipment that was utilized in more favorable conditions. Though they did not look as exquisite as they normally would, they were kept warm by their clothing, and in the end, practicality was far more important than aesthetics when it came to an army's gear. As such, the men ate their crackers and pork under the falling snow while the explosive shells continued to bombard the city's thick stone walls. It had already been 3 days since the siege had begun, and Berengar was confident that the walls would soon come crumbling down after all the sections they had been bombarding were already in a miserable state. Just when Berengar was about to speak to his soldiers, he overheard the sound of stone crumbling down upon itself and the cheers of his men. Seeing that the wall had collapsed, Berengar quickly put on his steel skullcap and his feathered hat before marching to the front lines where his troops had quickly rallied. Finally, they would be able to seize the city. As for the castle's bombardment, that would still take a few days. With sword in hand, Berengar cried out to his force as he rushed for the shattered section of the wall. Charge! The overwhelming majority of the soldiers in his camp rushed to the broken wall with bayonets affixed and swords in hand as they resisted the oncoming missile fire from the archers and crossbowmen above. Luckily for them, their vitals were covered in hardened steel plate armor, so as long as they were not shot in the face, they would endure the rain of arrows descending upon them. Berengar's forces quickly arrived in front of the wall, where they formed a firing line and rained musket balls upon the defenders who filled the gaps. The mighty spear wall the garrison of the city had formed quickly collapsed under the lead balls, which pierced their armor as if it were non-existent, and sent them to the afterlife. The defensive line collapsed with a single volley and was quickly rushed upon by a sea of bayonets and swords. Those troops in the rear of Berengar's formation continued to fire upon the defenders upon the ramparts, rapidly cutting away at the archers' numbers who desperately tried to combat the tide of black and gold which forced its way through the gap within the city wall. The wall was brought down under concentrated fire from Berengar's artillery battalion in 3 sections. Each region was undergoing a similar sight. Berengar batted a spear out of his way with the blade of his sword before lunging directly into the open bassinet of the city defender, piercing through the man's eye and thus his skull, ending his miserable existence. He was leading the charge at the center gap within the city's defenses. Slowly but surely, his troops were overwhelming the local garrison. Eckhard was leading one of the other locations, where he used his rifled musket and bayonet to outmaneuver a spear that was thrust in his direction before piercing through the man's mail and gambeson with the lengthy bayonet, which was shaped perfectly to get through the gaps in the mail hauberk. Like Berengar, he led the forces into battle as the city defenders slowly began retreating. Eventually, the defensive line was broken. Rather than pursue the fleeing garrison to the keep, Berengar's forces lined up, reloaded, and fired upon the city's defenders as their backs were turned, instantly gunning them down with no remorse. Berengar, Eckhard, and the commander of the 3rd section all yelled out similar commands to their forces. Give no quarter. As the soldiers of Berengar's army advanced through the city, they gunned down anyone who was remotely garbed in armor or equipped with a weapon. At the moment, Berengar was leading his forces through the city, where a crossbow bolt was fired out of a window and into his breastplate, where it left a mild dent. Enraged by the action, Berniger commanded a nearby grenadier to lob his grenade through the window. After lighting the fuse, the grenadier did as instructed, and within seconds, the grenade went off, after which Berengar led his forces into the building to clear it completely. When Berengar burst through the door, he witnessed a horrific scene. The crossbowman inside the building was utterly torn apart by the fearsome blast and shrapnel of the grenade, but so were what appeared to be the remains of a mother and her 2 daughters. Evidently, these civilians were hiding in the room where the crossbowman had taken his position. Berengar could not prevent himself from sighing at the scene as he spoke his thoughts aloud while the rest of his soldiers cleared the building. Such is the price of war. Similar scenes could be seen throughout the city, as the archers and crossbowmen took refuge in buildings before firing upon the advancing enemy, which would result in a grenade or 2 being lobbed into the structure, killing every living thing inside. Though Berengar prohibited the deliberate targeting of civilians, he did not prevent his soldiers from clearing a room with the most effective methods available, even if it meant the death of innocents. As such, the city was rapidly taken, and the city's defenders either fled to the castle as the last defense or were killed in the streets. Berengar's casualties were extremely low due to the high degree of protection the hardened and quenched half-plate armor afforded to his soldiers. The cavalry suffered even less than the infantry, as they were equipped with 3/4 plate armor, and though dismounted, they took part in the siege as well. Soon enough, the city was secured, and all that remained was to bring down the castle and the noblemen within it cowering behind their walls. As such, the artillery was moved into the city and lined up in a manner to attack the walls of the castle. Within a few days, Schwarz would completely fall to Berengar, and he would show no mercy to the young lord who acted as regent. All of this could have been avoided if the foolish boy had just stayed within his city and had not bothered attacking Berengar's forces as he advanced onto Innsbruck. Ultimately, someone had to pay the price for the lives lost in the ambush, and that was left to the Viscount's son and heir, who ruled in his stead while he was off committing treason.